Welcome to Caveman Sleep Stories. If you're here tonight, you're probably looking for rest, something to quiet your thoughts and help you sleep. We take warmth for granted now. A thermostat, a heated blanket, walls that keep cold out. But there was a time when winter cold could kill you in hours, when staying warm wasn't automatic but required constant effort and deep knowledge. Tonight, we're exploring how people survived brutal winters without any modern heating. How did they keep warm enough to sleep? How did they protect themselves from temperatures that would freeze exposed skin in minutes? How did they make it through months of cold that tested every survival strategy they knew? We'll look at the layered clothing systems they developed, the sleeping arrangements that multiplied body heat, the foods they ate specifically for warmth, the shelters they modified, and the daily strategies that kept them alive. If you drift off while listening, that's exactly right. Consider subscribing if these stories help you rest, and there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description if you'd like to support this channel. A like helps others find these stories too. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's go back to a time when staying warm through winter was the difference between survival and death. Morning begins with cold that has substance, weight, presence, not just temperature but a physical force pressing against skin, seeping through any gap in protection, searching constantly for warmth to steal. You wake to this reality every winter morning, the knowledge that your body's heat is precious and limited, that maintaining it through the day requires constant attention to details that might seem trivial until you understand how quickly cold can kill when defenses fail even briefly. The first layer against skin is soft deer hide worn fur side inward, the supple leather conforming to body contours, while the fine fur creates a barrier that traps a thin layer of air warmed by skin heat. This inner layer is not changed daily or even weekly, but worn continuously through winter, becoming almost a second skin that the body warms once and then maintains rather than having to warm fresh cold material every morning. The hide covers from neck to ankles, from shoulders to wrists, full body coverage with no gaps where cold could reach skin directly. The softness of this inner layer matters more than you might expect. Rough hide or poorly prepared leather would chafe and irritate during the constant movement that winter survival demands. Walking through snow, climbing slopes to check game trails, bending and reaching to gather firewood, all the physical work that generates the movement-based warmth that supplements inadequate fire heat through the active day. Soft hide allows all this movement without creating the raw spots and abrasions that would make every motion painful and that could become infected in conditions where healing is slow and medical knowledge is limited to what experience has taught about which plants might help and which definitely make things worse. The inner layer is worn fitted but not tight, allowing slight air circulation between skin and hide that manages the moisture that bodies produce even in cold conditions. Too tight and sweat accumulates against skin, dampness that conducts cold far more effectively than dry material ever would, turning what should be insulation into a channel for heat loss. Too loose and air circulates too freely, carrying away warmth rather than trapping it. The fit is adjusted with leather ties at waist and wrists and ankles, tightened or loosened based on activity level and outside temperature, creating seal points that prevent cold air from infiltrating up sleeves or pant legs while still allowing enough air movement to prevent excessive moisture buildup. Over the inner layer goes the middle layer, thicker hide garments with fur facing outward, chosen from animals whose fur provides optimal insulation for the weight and bulk it adds. Reindeer hide is prized for this middle layer because its hollow hair structure traps air so effectively, each hair essentially a tiny insulation tube that creates remarkable warmth relative to the hide's weight. The middle layer is looser than the inner layer, creating dead airspace between the two layers that becomes one of the most important elements of the entire warmth system. Dead airspace is the secret that makes layered clothing work. the principle that won't be formally understood for thousands of years, but that experience has taught through generations of trial and error. Air itself is excellent insulator. It conducts heat very poorly compared to solid materials or liquids. But air that's free to move carries heat away through convection, warm air rising, and being replaced by cold air in continuous cycle that defeats insulation. Trapped air, air held in place between layers so it cannot circulate, maintains the warmth that passes into it from body heat without allowing that warmth to escape outward. The space between inner and middle layers becomes a buffer zone, a thermal barrier that dramatically reduces heat loss compared to what a single thick layer would achieve. The middle layer tunic extends to mid-thigh, providing coverage for core organs and upper legs, where maintaining warmth is most critical for survival. The leggings overlap with the tunic at the waist, tied securely so no gap exists where cold could penetrate to skin. Every potential entry point for cold air is sealed or minimized. The neck opening is small, just large enough to pull the tunic overhead, and can be tightened with drawstring if needed. Sleeve openings fit snugly at wrists without being so tight they restrict blood flow. The overlap and tie system at the waist creates double thickness that prevents the gap that would exist if tunic and leggings merely met without overlapping. Fur direction on the middle layer matters in ways that affect both warmth and function. The reindeer hide is worn with fur facing outward, which seems counterintuitive until you understand the multiple purposes this serves. Outward-facing fur sheds snow and moisture rather than absorbing it. Flakes land on the fur tips and can be brushed off before melting, whereas fur facing inward would trap snow against the inner layer where body heat would melt it and create the dampness that destroys insulation. Outward fur also creates a slightly smoother surface for the outer layer to slide against when that third layer is needed, reducing the binding and catching that would happen if fur from middle and outer layers were both facing the same direction and interlocking. The outer layer is reserved for the coldest conditions or for times when exposure to wind and weather is unavoidable. Venturing out to check on cached food supplies, hunting when game is scarce and waiting for perfect conditions is not option. Traveling between shelters when staying put is not viable. This outer layer might be thick bear hide or multiple caribou hides sewn together, heavy and bulky but providing the final barrier against cold that can drop to 30 or 40 below zero when Arctic air masses settle over the region for days at a time. The outer layer is worn loosely over the middle layer, creating another dead air space that adds to the cumulative insulating effect of the layered system. This outermost space is larger than the space between inner and middle layers, perhaps an inch of air gap rather than half an inch, because the outer layer doesn't need to conform to body shape the way inner layers do. It just needs to create a shell that holds still air in place while blocking wind that would otherwise strip away the warmth those inner layers have worked to create and maintain. Putting on the outer layer is work in itself, the heavy hide awkward to manage, the bulk making movement more difficult, but the warmth it provides in severe cold makes the inconvenience worthwhile. The outer tunic might weigh 15 or 20 pounds, the leggings another 10 pounds. Wearing them for hours is tiring simply from carrying their weight, but that same weight and thickness is what makes them effective at blocking the cold that would penetrate lighter layers. During moderate cold or when working hard enough that movement generates significant body heat, the outer layer comes off and serves other purposes, laid over a rock or log to create a seat that insulates from cold ground, draped across shoulders while resting to provide extra warmth without the bulk of wearing it fully, or used as additional sleeping insulation at night when every bit of warmth-trapping material contributes to survivable sleep conditions. The layering system is not static through the day, but constantly adjusted based on activity level and changing conditions. Working hard, splitting wood, hauling game back to shelter, climbing a slope to reach better hunting ground, generates enough body heat that wearing all layers would create overheating and sweating that would soak clothing and turn insulation into cold conductor. During intense work, the outer layer is removed, and sometimes even the middle layer is loosened or briefly removed to allow heat to dissipate before sweat can accumulate. This adjustment requires judgment developed through experience, the understanding that you want to stay slightly cool during hard work, rather than allowing yourself to overheat, because the sweat that seems like a minor issue during exertion becomes dangerous as soon as activity stops, and that moisture starts conducting cold directly to skin. People learn to read their own bodies, to notice the first hint of sweat breaking out, and to shed a layer before that sweat soaks into hide to allow slight coolness during work, rather than comfortable warmth that inevitably leads to moisture that will cause problems later. Conversely, when activity stops, pausing to rest, stopping to eat, settling in at day's end, layers are added before cold has a chance to penetrate. The outer layer goes back on during the rest period, trapping the warmth that hard work generated before that warmth can dissipate, using the body's own heat production as fuel that gets conserved through layering rather than allowed to escape. The practice of adding layers before you feel cold, rather than waiting until cold is already penetrating, is one of those survival skills that separates people who manage winter well from those who struggle. The proactive approach that prevents problems rather than reacting to them after they've already begun creating issues. Children's clothing follows the same layering principles, but is made from softer, lighter hides that are easier for small bodies to move in while still providing adequate insulation. A child wearing the same heavy bear hide that an adult uses for an outer layer would be unable to move effectively, the weight and bulk overwhelming their smaller frame and limited strength. Instead, children's outer layers might be made from multiple thinner hides sewn together, creating equivalent insulation with less individual hide thickness and weight. Children also need more frequent adjustment of their layering because their higher activity levels during play generate more heat relative to their body size, and because their less developed judgment about warmth management means adults must monitor them for signs of overheating or inadequate insulation. A child running and playing in the snow can go from adequately warm to sweating in minutes, and an adult's job is to intervene before that sweat soaks clothing and creates the conditions for dangerous cold exposure when the play eventually stops. Elders face different clothing challenges, their bodies generating less heat than prime adults even during activity, their circulation less efficient at distributing warmth to extremities, their experience with cold making them acutely aware of how quickly inadequate insulation can turn from discomfort to serious danger. Elders often wear an additional thin layer between the standard inner and middle layers, a light rabbit hide or young deer skin that adds minimal bulk but provides extra insulation where their lower heat production makes additional protection necessary. The clothing system represents enormous investment of resources gathered over seasons or years. Each hide embodies a successful hunt. Each preparation embodies days of scraping and treating and drying. Each repair embodies attention to maintenance that keeps materials functional through multiple winters. An adult's complete winter clothing system might include 2 or 3 inner layer hides rotated for occasional cleaning, 2 middle layer sets to allow for one to be in use while the other is being repaired or dried, and 1 heavy outer layer that's treated as precious possession requiring constant care to maintain its effectiveness. Damage to clothing is treated as serious problem requiring immediate attention. A tear in the inner layer near a seam is repaired the same day it's noticed, stitched carefully with sinew thread to create a seal that prevents the tear from spreading and creating a gap where cold could reach skin. A thin spot in the middle layer gets reinforced with a patch before it becomes a hole. Even small damage that seems cosmetic is addressed quickly because winter gives no grace period. What's a minor tear in autumn becomes a life-threatening gap in midwinter when temperatures plunge and every weakness in your protective layers becomes a route for cold to invade and steal the warmth your body struggles to maintain. The layering system is not just about trapping warmth, but about managing it, about creating flexibility that allows response to changing conditions and activity levels, about maintaining the delicate balance where the body stays warm enough for comfort and function, but not so warm that moisture becomes a problem. The system represents sophisticated understanding of heat transfer and insulation that won't be formally explained in scientific terms for millennia, but that was learned through lived experience, through winters where people tried different approaches and discovered what worked, through accumulated knowledge passed down as practical advice that keeps people alive when cold becomes not just discomfort, but active threat that will kill without adequate protection. You adjust your layers as morning progresses into day, reading the subtle signals your body sends about warmth and cold, making small changes that maintain the thermal balance that allows you to work and move and function through another winter day when the cold is always there, always pressing, always seeking any weakness in the layers that stand between your living warmth and the deadly cold that surrounds you. The clothing creates barriers against cold, but the materials themselves vary enormously in their warming properties, and understanding which animal furs provide the best insulation for their weight and availability determines whether your winter clothing works adequately or fails when conditions become severe. Reindeer fur stands above almost all other options for creating warmth with minimum weight and bulk, each hair hollow like a tiny tube filled with air. This structural characteristic makes reindeer fur extraordinary. The air trapped inside each hair adds essentially no weight, but provides insulation that solid hair could never match. A reindeer hide weighing 10 pounds provides more warmth than a bear hide weighing 20 pounds, a difference that matters enormously when you're wearing these materials through long days of winter activity where every additional pound of clothing weight costs energy to carry. The hollow structure of reindeer hair is not immediately obvious when you examine the fur. The hairs look solid until you look very closely or cut one open to see the hollow core. But the effect is obvious when you wear reindeer fur in severe cold. It's warmer than its weight suggests it should be, warmer than experience with other furs would lead you to expect. And this unexpected warmth is what makes reindeer hide so valued for the middle layer where insulation matters most. Reindeer fur also has the advantage of varying significantly in density and length, depending on when the animal was killed and which part of the hide you're using. Winter-killed reindeer have dense, full fur that's grown out in response to cold, longer guard hairs overlying thick underfur that creates multiple layers of insulation within the hide itself. Autumn-killed reindeer have shorter, less dense fur that's just beginning to develop its winter characteristics. The densest fur comes from the back and shoulder areas where the animal needed maximum protection from cold, while belly and leg areas have sparser, shorter fur. This variation allows for strategic use of different sections of reindeer hide for different purposes. The densest back fur becomes the central panel of a tunic, positioned over the core where maintaining warmth is most critical. The shorter leg fur becomes sleeves or leg coverings where less insulation is needed and where the reduced bulk makes movement easier. Using hide sections according to their insulation properties, rather than just cutting whatever pattern is most convenient, represents the kind of sophisticated material use that maximizes the value of each hide. Bear fur provides different characteristics, dense and heavy with excellent insulation, but without the hollow hair advantage of reindeer. A bear hide is thick, the fur composed of long guard hairs over dense underfur, the whole system effective at trapping air and blocking wind. Bear hide works well for outer layers or for sleeping covers where weight is less important than total insulation value, and where the hide size, a mature bear providing a single hide large enough to cover multiple people, makes it useful for purposes where reindeer hides smaller size would require piecing together multiple hides. Bear fur also has the characteristic of being slightly oily, the guard hairs having natural water resistance that makes them shed moisture and snow better than some other furs. This property makes bear hide valuable for outer layers that face direct exposure to weather. Snow falling on bear fur tends to slide off or can be brushed away before melting, while some other furs would catch and hold snow until body heat melted it and created the dampness that undermines insulation. Bison hide offers different advantages: thick and tough with relatively short, dense fur that provides moderate insulation but exceptional wind blocking. Bison hide is heavy, a full hide from a mature animal weighing 30 pounds or more, but that weight comes with durability that makes it ideal for items that take hard use. Bison hide boots last longer than deer hide boots because the leather is thicker and more resistant to abrasion from walking on rough ground and snow. Bison hide mittens protect hands better than lighter hides because the thickness prevents sharp objects from penetrating through to cause injury. The short, dense bison fur also has less tendency to catch on brush and branches than longer furs do, making bison hide practical for leg coverings where you're constantly moving through vegetation that would snag and pull at longer fur. The trade-off is weight. Bison hide leggings are noticeably heavier than reindeer hide leggings of equivalent coverage. But for people who don't need to travel long distances regularly, the durability advantage outweighs the weight disadvantage. Mammoth hide presents unique characteristics, though obtaining it requires either the extraordinary luck of finding a recently deceased animal or the organized effort of a group hunt that carries real danger of injury or death. Mammoth hide is thick beyond what other animals provide, a half-inch or more at the back and shoulders, thinner but still substantial at other areas. And this thickness provides insulation through sheer mass of material rather than through fur characteristics. Mammoth fur is relatively short and coarse compared to other options, not particularly effective as insulation on its own. But the hide's thickness makes it valuable for specific purposes: ground covers that need to withstand constant abrasion, outer layers for people who work in conditions where hide damage is frequent, and a thicker hide lasts longer before needing replacement, sleeping pit barriers where thickness matters more than weight. The hide size. A single mammoth providing hide that can cover very large areas also makes it useful where piecing together multiple smaller hides would create seams that are weak points for both structural integrity and insulation. Wolf fur provides insulation that's good relative to weight, with dense underfur under longer guard hairs that create the layered structure that traps air effectively. Wolf hide's primary advantage is its size relative to the effort required to obtain it. Wolves are smaller and less dangerous to hunt than bears or bison, making wolf hide more accessible when larger animals aren't available or when hunting conditions make pursuing large game impractical. Wolf fur also has natural patterns that some groups value for identification or decoration, though functionality matters more than appearance when winter survival is the primary concern. Rabbit and hare furs offer the softest option, with extremely fine, dense fur that's comfortable against skin, but that lacks durability for outer layers or heavy use. Rabbit hide works well for infant clothing, where softness matters for delicate skin and where the lighter weight is appropriate for babies who don't move enough to generate significant body heat through activity. Rabbit fur is also useful for liners in mittens or boots, where its softness reduces friction and where it's protected from abrasion by outer layers of tougher hide. Multiple rabbit hides can be sewn together to create larger items, though the time investment in catching enough rabbits and preparing enough small hides to make a full garment is substantial. But in regions where rabbits are abundant and larger game is scarce, rabbit fur becomes an important resource for winter clothing, particularly for children who outgrow clothing quickly enough that the limited durability of rabbit hide is less problematic than it would be for adults who need clothing to last multiple years. Fox fur combines reasonable insulation with beautiful coloring that makes it valued for trim and decoration, though function remains primary consideration. Fox hide is often used for hood linings, where the soft fur frames the face and provides warmth without excessive weight, or for cuffs and collar trim, where the fur creates seal points that prevent cold air from infiltrating at openings. Fox fur is dense enough to provide real warmth, but not so heavy that its use in strategic locations adds burdensome weight to the overall clothing system. Seal and other marine mammal furs provide insulation even when wet. The oily nature of the fur and the density of the underfur creating water resistance that makes these materials valuable for people living in coastal areas where exposure to moisture is common. The trade-off is that seal fur is heavier than land animal furs of equivalent insulation value, and in dry inland winter conditions where moisture is not primary concern, lighter furs from land animals are more practical choices. The selection of furs for winter clothing is not based on simple ranking of best to worst, but on understanding the specific properties each fur provides and matching those properties to the specific purposes each garment serves. The inner layer needs softness and light weight, deer or young reindeer. The middle layer needs maximum insulation with reasonable weight, adult reindeer or wolf. The outer layer needs durability and wind blocking, bison or bear. Each position in the layering system has optimal materials, and using those materials appropriately creates clothing system that works far better than random selection would achieve. The preparation of hides determines whether the fur performs well or poorly. A hide that's poorly scraped retains fat and tissue that rot and create smell and attract insects. A hide that's overscraped loses thickness and durability and may have thin spots where the scraping tool cut too deep. The ideal preparation removes all tissue and fat without damaging the leather itself, then treats the hide to maintain suppleness that allows the material to move with the body rather than staying stiff and creating pressure points and restricting movement. Treatment methods vary by region and tradition, but all involve working the hide repeatedly to break down the fibers that would otherwise make the leather stiff. Some groups use animal brains, which contain oils that lubricate the hide fibers and create supple leather. Others use a combination of scraping, stretching, and working the hide while it dries, physically breaking down the structures that create stiffness. The time investment is substantial. Preparing a single hide properly requires multiple days of work spread over a week or more. But poorly prepared hide creates clothing that doesn't work well, making the time investment essential rather than optional. The fur itself requires attention beyond just the hide preparation. Fur can become matted or damaged, the hairs breaking or tangling in ways that reduce the air-trapping properties that create insulation. Regular grooming with combs made from bone or wood keeps fur aligned and functional, prevents matting that would compress the fur and reduce its insulation, and allows early detection of damage that needs repair before it becomes serious enough to compromise the clothing's effectiveness. Understanding animal furs, which provide the best insulation, which are most durable, which work in which conditions, how to prepare them properly, how to maintain them through the winter, represents knowledge that's as important as any hunting skill or fire-making ability. The best hunter in the world will struggle to survive winter if their clothing is made from poor fur choices, poorly prepared and inadequately maintained. The clothing is not just covering but technology, carefully engineered from materials whose properties are thoroughly understood and strategically employed to create the protection that makes human survival possible in cold that would kill unprotected bodies in hours. You wear these materials through the winter day, feeling how reindeer fur middle layer provides warmth without excessive bulk, how bison hide outer layer blocks wind when conditions demand it, how rabbit fur boot liners create softness that prevents the friction that would damage feet during long days of movement. The furs are not decoration or cultural expression, but survival tools chosen and used with the same attention to function and effectiveness that goes into selecting stone for tool making or wood for fire. The right fur in the right place makes the difference between adequate warmth and dangerous cold, between surviving winter and becoming one more casualty of a season that offers no forgiveness for ignorance about the materials that stand between your living warmth and the cold that surrounds you. The layers of clothing and the careful selection of furs create insulation, but that insulation only works effectively when air trapped between layers remains still rather than circulating. Creating and maintaining dead airspace, the invisible insulating barrier that makes layered clothing actually warm, requires understanding principles that won't be formally explained until modern physics arrives, but that experience has taught through generations of trial and error. Air by itself is one of nature's best insulators, conducting heat very poorly compared to solid materials or liquids. Touch stone in winter, and heat flows rapidly from your warm hand into cold rock, the sensation of cold immediate and intense. Touch still air, and heat transfer is far slower, the sensation of cold much less immediate. This difference in heat transfer rate is why air makes such effective insulation. It simply doesn't conduct warmth away from your body efficiently, but air that moves freely defeats its own insulating properties through convection. Warm air rises naturally, being less dense than cold air, and this rising creates circulation that carries heat away despite air's poor thermal conductivity. Stand naked in still, cold air, and you lose heat far faster than air's thermal properties alone would suggest, because your body heat warms the air immediately around you. That warm air rises and is replaced by cold air, the cycle continuing constantly and stripping away warmth through convection rather than through conduction. Clothing defeats this convection by trapping air, holding it in place so it cannot circulate freely and carry heat away. The air between your inner layer and your skin warms from body heat and then stays there, maintained at skin temperature or close to it, creating a warm buffer layer that dramatically reduces heat loss. The air between inner and middle layers similarly warms and remains trapped, adding another insulating buffer. Each dead airspace contributes to the total insulation, the cumulative effect creating far more warmth than any single thick layer could provide. The space between layers needs to be just right. Too small, and there's not enough air volume to provide significant insulation. Too large, and air can circulate within the space and defeat the trapping effect. Experience has shown that a gap of roughly 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch between inner and middle layers provides optimal insulation. Less than 1/2 inch and the insulation benefit diminishes noticeably. More than an inch and you start getting enough air circulation within the gap that insulation suffers despite the increased air volume. Creating this optimal spacing requires attention to how clothing is sized and fitted. The inner layer fits relatively close to skin, but not so tight that it compresses and eliminates airspace at pressure points, like shoulders and hips. The middle layer is sized to hang loosely over the inner layer, creating that half-inch gap consistently across most of the body's surface. At tie points, waist, wrists, ankles, the layers are drawn closer together to prevent cold air from infiltrating up through the bottom or down through the neck. But these seal points are small compared to the large surface areas where the optimal spacing is maintained. The dead airspace is not uniform across all body areas, and this variation actually helps with warmth management. At the chest and back, where large surface areas don't have bony prominences interfering, the air gap can be relatively consistent. At shoulders and elbows and knees, where bone structure creates irregular contours, the air gap varies from point to point. These variations don't undermine insulation significantly because the overall average spacing is still in the effective range, and the contact points where clothing touches skin at bony prominences are small enough that heat loss through them is minimal compared to the large insulated areas. Movement affects dead airspace in ways that require attention and adjustment. Walking or working causes clothing to shift and move, sometimes compressing the air gaps at certain points and expanding them at others. Reaching overhead to grab a branch or bending to pick up firewood temporarily collapses air spaces in some areas. This is why clothing needs to be sized with enough looseness that normal movement doesn't completely eliminate air gaps. The middle layer needs to be large enough that when you raise your arms, it doesn't pull tight against the inner layer and eliminate all insulation at your sides and back. Children's clothing requires special attention to dead airspace because children grow constantly and because their higher activity levels create more movement-related compression of air gaps. Clothing that fit properly a month ago might now be too small, the layers pressing too close together and reducing insulation. Parents monitor children's clothing fit carefully, looking for signs that air gaps are being compressed. Clothing that's becoming difficult to move in, visible tightness when the child bends or reaches, areas where outer and inner layers seem to be touching when they should be separated. The solution is sizing children's clothing larger than current needs, building in room for growth that creates slightly larger air gaps initially, but that will shrink to optimal spacing as the child grows into the garments. The trade-off is that very large air gaps in oversized clothing can allow some circulation, reducing insulation effectiveness. But the compromise usually works well because children's higher activity levels generate more body heat that compensates for slightly reduced insulation from oversized garments. Damaged clothing compromises dead airspace in ways that affect warmth more than the damage's visible extent would suggest. A small tear in the middle layer might seem minor, just a couple of inches of damaged hide. But that tear creates a path for air circulation that undermines insulation across a much larger area. Cold outside air can enter through the tear, flow between the layers, and exit through neck or wrist openings, creating convection within what should be still, trapped air. This is why even small damage gets repaired immediately rather than being tolerated until it becomes larger. The small tear's effect on dead airspace integrity is disproportionate to its size. Moisture is dead airspace's worst enemy, converting effective insulation into cold conductor within minutes. When clothing becomes damp from sweat or from snow melting against body heat, water fills the air spaces between fibers in the hide and fur, and water conducts heat far more effectively than air does. A hide that was providing excellent insulation becomes nearly useless once it's wet, warmth flowing through the water-filled material almost as readily as it would flow through bare skin. This is why moisture management, preventing sweat during hard work, brushing snow off clothing before it can melt, allowing damp clothing to dry before wearing it again, matters so much for winter survival. It's not just about comfort, but about maintaining the dead airspace that makes clothing work as insulation. Damp clothing might as well be no clothing at all in terms of warmth retention, and damp clothing in extreme cold becomes actively dangerous as the moisture freezes and creates ice layers that conduct cold even more efficiently than liquid water does. Drying damp clothing requires care because you want to remove moisture without damaging the hide or fur. Too much direct heat causes hide to stiffen and lose its suppleness, making it less comfortable and less effective. Too little heat and drying takes so long that the clothing is unavailable for use during multiple cold days when it's needed. The balance is hanging damp clothing near fire, but not close enough to scorch, positioning it where warm air circulation carries moisture away gradually over hours rather than trying to dry it quickly with intense heat. Wind defeats dead airspace even through intact dry clothing if the outer layer is not wind-resistant enough. Wind pressure pushes air through any gaps in the outer layer, gaps at seams, gaps where different hide sections meet, even gaps between individual leather fibers if the hide is thin or loosely woven. This infiltrating air disrupts the still air spaces between layers, creating circulation that carries away warmth. An outer layer that's adequate in still air might be completely inadequate in wind, the wind pressure forcing cold air through the material faster than body heat can warm it. This is why outer layers are made from thick, dense hide with tightly packed fur that resists air penetration. Materials like bison hide or bear hide, where the thickness and density create barriers that wind cannot easily push through. The heavier weight and bulk of these materials is the price you pay for wind resistance that maintains dead airspace integrity even when wind is blowing hard enough to penetrate lighter materials. The outer layer also needs to seal well at openings. Hood pulled tight around face so wind cannot blow down inside the tunic, sleeves fitting snugly at wrists, the waist tied firmly so wind cannot push up from below. Each unsealed opening is a route for wind to infiltrate and disrupt dead air spaces, and each disruption undermines the insulation system's effectiveness. Sealing these openings makes clothing feel more confining and less comfortable, but makes the difference between adequate warmth and dangerous cold exposure when wind is strong. Dead airspace management explains why people sometimes feel colder when they put on too many layers. Adding a fourth layer over 3 layers that are already working well can compress the air spaces between existing layers, reducing their effectiveness more than the new layer's insulation compensates. The ideal is finding the minimum number of layers that creates adequate dead airspace without compression. Usually 2 or 3 layers for most conditions, rather than simply piling on as many layers as possible and assuming more is always better. Understanding dead airspace also explains why adjusting layers based on activity works so well for warmth management. During hard work when body heat generation increases, removing an outer layer before you start sweating maintains the dead air spaces in remaining layers without the moisture that would destroy their effectiveness. During rest after work, when heat generation drops, adding that outer layer back before you cool down traps the warmth your body generated and maintains it within the now expanded dead air spaces of the full layer system. The dead airspace principle applies beyond just clothing layers to other aspects of staying warm. Sitting on a folded hide rather than directly on cold stone creates dead airspace between you and the ground, reducing heat loss downward. Wrapping a hide loosely around shoulders while resting creates dead airspace around your upper body that adds insulation beyond what your clothing alone provides. Even arranging sleeping furs with air gaps between layers creates dead air insulation that works while you sleep. The same principle applied to different situations. Children learn about dead airspace not through explanation, but through demonstration and experience. They learn that clothing needs to be a bit loose, not tight. They learn that getting clothing wet makes you cold in ways that seem out of proportion to how wet the clothing is. They learn that adding layers helps until it doesn't, that there's a point where more layers make things worse. These lessons are taught through practice and correction. A parent adjusting a child's clothing to create better air gaps, removing an unnecessary layer that's causing compression, explaining through action and limited words what creates warmth and what undermines it. The sophistication of dead air space management, understanding optimal spacing, maintaining it through movement and adjustment, protecting it from moisture and wind, knowing when to add layers and when to remove them, represents knowledge that's as complex as any hunting technique or food preservation method. It's physics applied intuitively, thermal dynamics understood through experience rather than theory, engineering practiced by people who have no formal education, but who understand through lived experience what works and what doesn't. When the consequence of getting it wrong is death from cold exposure. You adjust your layers through the day, consciously maintaining the air gaps that create invisible insulation, checking that moisture hasn't compromised the spaces between layers, ensuring that wind hasn't infiltrated and disrupted the still air that traps warmth. The dead air space is not something you can see or touch directly, but you can feel its effect in the warmth that surrounds you, despite bitter cold beyond your clothing, in the ability to function and work and survive through winter days when unprotected bodies would freeze in the time it takes to gather one armload of firewood. The air between your layers is what stands between you and the cold, and maintaining those spaces is what makes the difference between adequate winter survival and the slow decline toward hypothermia that begins the moment your insulation system fails. The clothing and dead air space create passive insulation, but staying warm through a winter day requires active heat generation through constant movement that burns calories and produces the body heat that makes insulation effective. Still, bodies cool regardless of clothing quality. Movement is essential for maintaining the warmth that layers merely conserve. Morning begins with movement even before fully waking, bodies stirring in the sleeping area as consciousness gradually returns, and cold penetrates enough to make remaining still uncomfortable. Small movements start first, flexing fingers and toes to restore circulation after hours of relative stillness, shifting position to relieve pressure points, stretching arms and legs in ways that get blood flowing to extremities. These initial movements are not vigorous, but they're essential, generating enough heat to make rising from the sleeping area tolerable rather than shocking. Rising from sleep involves more substantial movement, pushing up from the sleeping position, standing and stretching fully, walking to the fire area where warmth supplements the body heat that movement is starting to generate. The first minutes after rising are often the coldest of the day because the body has been at rest for hours and hasn't yet built up the heat production that activity creates. The fire provides external warmth during this vulnerable period, allowing you to warm sufficiently that the day's necessary movements don't start from a position of deep cold. The first work of the day, rekindling fire to full strength, preparing morning food, organizing equipment for the day ahead, provides movement that gradually builds heat production. Each task involves walking between cave areas, bending to pick up objects, using arms and hands to manipulate materials. This movement is not intense enough to create sweat, but it's enough to raise metabolism from its sleep-reduced state, generating warmth that starts flowing through the body and beginning the process of active warming that will continue through the day. As morning progresses into the main activity period, movement intensifies according to what needs to be accomplished. Gathering firewood requires walking considerable distances through snow, often uphill to areas where dead-standing trees can be found. Each step in snow is work, legs lifting high to clear drifts, feet pushing down through snow that might be knee-deep or deeper, body balance constantly adjusting to uneven terrain hidden under smooth white surfaces. This walking generates significant heat, heart rate increasing, breathing deepening, metabolism ramping up to provide the energy that sustained effort demands. The work of felling dead trees and processing them into manageable pieces adds to heat generation. Swinging a stone axe repeatedly to cut through wood requires upper body strength and creates exertion that elevates body temperature measurably. After 20 minutes of this work, your inner layer might be damp with sweat despite outside temperature being well below freezing, your face flushed with the heat that intense muscular work produces. This is the signal to pause and adjust clothing, removing the outer layer if you're wearing it, perhaps loosening the middle layer ties to allow some heat dissipation before sweat soaks through and creates the moisture that will become a problem when activity stops. Hauling firewood back to shelter provides different but equally demanding movement. Carrying 40 or 50 pounds of wood across uneven snow-covered ground for a quarter mile or more is sustained effort that maintains elevated metabolism and heat production. The load strains back and leg muscles, heart rate stays elevated, breathing remains deep and steady. You might make 3 or 4 such trips in a morning, each one maintaining the high heat production that makes clothing almost too warm, creating the condition where you're generating so much heat that insulation becomes excessive rather than inadequate. This cycle of intense activity followed by rest periods creates fluctuation in heat production that requires constant clothing adjustment. During the firewood hauling, you might remove the outer layer and even loosen the middle layer to prevent overheating. During the rest period after returning with a load, you add layers back before the cooling begins, trapping the heat your work generated rather than allowing it to dissipate. This active management of insulation relative to activity level is ongoing through the day. You're constantly adding or removing layers, tightening or loosening ties, adjusting hoods and wraps based on whether you're working hard or resting. Different activities generate different amounts of heat and require different movement patterns. Checking trap lines involves steady walking but less intense effort than firewood processing, generating moderate heat that needs less aggressive cooling management. Working on hides, scraping and softening uses primarily arm and upper body muscles with less leg involvement, generating heat more in the upper body than lower body, and potentially requiring different clothing adjustments for different body areas. Hunting creates unique movement patterns depending on the approach being used. Still hunting, waiting motionless for game to appear along a known trail, generates minimal heat and can become dangerously cold if clothing isn't adequate for sustained stillness. Experienced hunters preparing for still hunting sessions add extra layers before taking position, anticipating that movement-generated heat will not be available and that clothing insulation must carry the entire warming burden. They also choose positions where they can do subtle movements without alerting game, shifting weight from foot to foot, flexing hands inside mittens, gentle torso twisting, movements that generate some heat without creating the motion or sound that would scare away prey. Tracking hunting creates opposite heat management challenges. Following game trails through snow, sometimes at pace approaching running when fresh tracks indicate prey is close, generates enormous heat that requires aggressive cooling management to prevent sweat accumulation. Hunters engaged in tracking often strip down to inner layer only, carrying their middle and outer layers in a pack rather than wearing them, accepting being slightly cool during the pursuit because they know overheating and sweating would create worse problems than slight cold produces. Children generate heat through play that adults generate through work, running and jumping and wrestling in the snow, building structures from snow blocks, playing hunting and stalking games that involve constant movement. This play keeps children warm through days when they're not involved in the serious work that adults do. Their constant motion maintaining body heat that their smaller mass and higher heat loss rate would otherwise make difficult to sustain. Adults monitor children's activity levels, ensuring they're moving enough to stay warm, but not so intensely that they're sweating through clothing that will be needed later when play energy flags. Evening brings different movement patterns as activity shifts from external work to internal cave tasks. Processing food, maintaining equipment, preparing sleeping areas. These activities involve less intense movement than daytime work, but enough to maintain reasonable warmth when combined with fire proximity. The evening period is when clothing layers are adjusted toward the night configuration, making sure everything is dry, checking that tomorrow's clothing is accessible and ready, ensuring that sleeping garments are positioned where body heat during evening activities will warm them before they're needed. The constant need for movement to maintain warmth means that prolonged rest during winter daylight is difficult, unless you're very close to fire or have enough extra clothing to maintain warmth during stillness. People who are injured or ill and cannot move much become dangerously cold even inside shelter unless special provisions are made. Extra hides piled on them, hot stones positioned near them, their position maintained close to fire where external heat supplements their reduced internal heat production. This movement requirement also affects how winter survival locations are chosen. A shelter that's too far from firewood sources or game territories requires so much travel that the energy cost of movement becomes burdensome. A shelter well positioned relative to resources allows shorter trips that still generate adequate heat but that don't exhaust people through the enormous effort that long-distance travel in deep snow demands. The ideal winter territory allows movement that generates warming heat without requiring so much movement that calorie expenditure becomes unsustainable. Elderly people face particular challenges with movement-based warming because their bodies generate less heat per unit of effort than younger adults, and because injuries and joint problems accumulated over decades make sustained movement painful. Elders manage this by doing less intense work, but spreading it through longer periods, taking many small trips for firewood rather than fewer large loads, working on hide processing at a steady, moderate pace rather than in intense bursts, choosing activities that generate adequate heat without demanding maximum effort. The relationship between movement and warmth also affects sleep preparation. The final active period before sleep, evening meal preparation and consumption, arranging sleeping areas, final fire tending, keeps the body warm through the transition from day to night. This movement-generated warmth combines with food-generated warmth and fire proximity to ensure that people enter the sleeping area already warm rather than cold, making the first hours of sleep more comfortable and less likely to be disrupted by the cold that would wake someone who went to bed without adequate warming. Some movements are specifically done for warming rather than for accomplishing other tasks. Vigorous exercises that seem purposeless, but that generate heat when cold threatens. Jumping in place, swinging arms rapidly, running short distances back and forth. These activities produce significant heat quickly, useful when cold exposure is becoming dangerous and immediate warming is needed. These warming movements are particularly important during weather that prevents normal work activities, keeping the body warm through days when storms make leaving shelter impossible and when the usual movement of daily work isn't available for heat generation. The principle that movement generates heat also affects social organization of winter groups. People who cannot or will not contribute to physical work, maintaining activity levels that generate heat and accomplish necessary survival tasks, become burdens that the group must carry by providing them with extra resources while getting less contribution in return. This reality creates social pressure toward participation, toward maintaining activity even when it's uncomfortable or difficult, because the alternative is becoming dependent on others' willingness to share resources that are already scarce. Children learn through direct experience that stillness makes you cold, that movement makes you warm, that the way to restore warmth after cold exposure is to move vigorously until heat returns. These lessons don't require explanation. The body teaches them directly through the discomfort of being cold and the relief of warmth returning with movement. By the time children are old enough to contribute to real work, they've internalized the understanding that surviving winter means moving constantly, maintaining the activity that generates the heat that makes insulation effective and that prevents the slow cooling that would otherwise occur whenever the body is at rest. You move through the winter day with this understanding in your body, if not explicitly in your mind, constantly adjusting activity level to maintain the heat production that keeps you warm, never allowing yourself to remain still long enough to cool deeply, organizing work so that rest periods happen near fire or happen briefly enough that cold doesn't have time to penetrate, using your body's ability to generate heat as the primary warming mechanism that makes all other warming strategies effective. The movement is not just activity, but survival technology, the method that humans have used since before recorded history to maintain warmth in conditions where passive insulation alone would never suffice. The constant motion that keeps bodies warm enough to work another hour, survive another day, make it through another winter toward the spring that will eventually arrive if you can just keep moving, keep generating heat, keep refusing to allow the cold to win. Movement generates internal heat, but external heat from fire remains crucial for warmth management through the winter day. Fire is not just a nighttime necessity, but a daytime tool, used strategically through waking hours to supplement body heat and provide warming that movement alone cannot always accomplish. Morning fire building begins before most people fully wake. The night watch person adding substantial wood to bring flames from the maintained overnight level up to vigorous burning that will warm the cave for the morning transition from sleep to activity. The fire that was adequate for sleeping, moderate flames providing steady background heat, needs to become more intense for waking, generating warmth that makes leaving the insulated sleeping area tolerable, and that provides external heat during the period when bodies are still sluggish from sleep and not yet generating significant warmth through movement. The morning fire burns bright and hot for perhaps an hour, using more wood than nighttime fire management, but providing warmth that's essential for the morning routine. People wake and move to the fire area, standing or sitting close to flames that drive away the night's accumulated cold, warming hands and faces and fronts of bodies, while backs remain cool but acceptable. This fire proximity allows people to function during the morning period when movement hasn't yet generated adequate body heat, preparing food, organizing equipment, planning the day's activities. As morning progresses and people begin moving actively, fire needs decrease because body heat generation increases. The fire is allowed to drop from vigorous burning to moderate levels, conserving wood for times when fire warmth is more essential. During midday, when activity levels are highest and bodies are generating abundant heat through work, fire might drop to barely more than coals, maintained alive but not actively warming because external warmth isn't needed when internal heat production is high. But fire is never allowed to die completely, even during periods when warmth isn't immediately needed, because restarting fire from nothing is difficult and time-consuming in winter conditions. Maintaining coals, keeping some part of the fire alive even when active flames aren't needed, means fire can be quickly rebuilt when circumstances change and external warmth becomes necessary again. A bed of glowing coals can be brought back to flames within minutes by adding dry kindling and small wood. A completely dead fire might take 30 minutes or more to restart from friction or flint and pyrite spark, time during which cold can become dangerous if someone needs warming immediately. Midday fire management depends on weather and work location. If work keeps people close to shelter where fire is easily accessible, fire can be maintained at low levels and quickly built up when needed. If work takes people far from shelter for hours at a time, morning fire is built up intensively before departure, creating coals that will last through the work period and that will still be alive when people return needing warmth. The alternative, building new fire at the work location, is possible, but uses energy and resources that could be conserved by strategic use of the established shelter fire. Afternoon brings changing fire needs as activity levels begin declining and as outside temperature drops with approaching evening. Fire is rebuilt to moderate levels, providing warmth for people returning from work and needing to warm cold hands and faces before beginning evening tasks. This afternoon, fire serves multiple purposes, providing warmth for people who are cooling down after work, heating water for cleaning or for evening meal preparation, maintaining sufficient heat in the cave interior that the transition to evening and night won't be shocking. The evening fire becomes larger and more carefully maintained as darkness approaches, providing warmth during the evening meal period when people are sitting relatively still and when body heat generation from movement has stopped but hasn't yet been replaced by the passive warmth of the sleeping arrangement. The evening fire also provides light that extends the useful day beyond what natural light would allow, giving time for final tasks and social interaction before sleep begins. Fire proximity during different parts of the day is adjusted based on needs and on how much heat the fire is generating. Morning fire proximity is very close. People might sit or stand within 3 or 4 feet of active flames, close enough to feel intense radiant heat on the sides of their bodies facing the fire. Midday fire proximity might be 10 or 15 feet, close enough to benefit from ambient warmth but not so close that the heat interferes with work or becomes uncomfortable when bodies are already warm from activity. Evening fire proximity is intermediate, perhaps 6 to 8 feet, providing comfortable warmth for sitting and eating without creating the intense heat that would be excessive. Different activities require different fire proximities. Hide scraping can be done close to fire because the work doesn't generate intense body heat, and because fire warmth makes the hide more supple and easier to work. Stone tool napping might be done further from fire because the precise work requires visual attention that fire glare can interfere with, and because the stone-on-stone percussion generates sparks that could be fire hazards if work is too close to flames. Cooking happens very close to fire out of necessity, requiring someone to tolerate intense heat while tending food. Children are monitored carefully around fire, their impulsive movements and less developed sense of danger making them vulnerable to burns from getting too close or from falling toward flames. Children are taught fire safety through combination of warning and demonstration, showing them the pain of briefly touching something very hot, explaining repeatedly about keeping distance from flames, and physically preventing them from approaching too close during moments when supervision lapses. Even with teaching, children are never left unsupervised near fire, adults always maintaining awareness of where children are relative to flames. The wood used for daytime fire is selected differently than nighttime wood. Daytime fire can use faster burning softwoods that provide quick heat for specific purposes, bringing water to boiling for cooking, creating intense heat for tool manufacture tasks that need high temperatures, generating bright flames for light during darker winter days when cloud cover makes the cave interior dim. Nighttime fire requires slow-burning hardwoods that maintain consistent heat with less frequent tending, but daytime fire prioritizes responsiveness. wood that catches quickly when heat is needed and that burns down quickly when heat needs are reduced. Fire also serves as tool in winter work. Beyond just providing warmth, wood can be hardened by careful heating in fire, making it more durable for use in tool handles or spear points. Hide can be dried near fire, moisture driven out by heat, without the hide being damaged by direct flames. Frozen meat can be thawed near fire, making it possible to process and eat food that would otherwise be rock hard and impossible to cut or chew. Each of these uses requires specific fire temperatures and proximities. Too much heat damages the material. Too little heat doesn't accomplish the task. The psychological importance of fire during winter days matches its physical importance. Fire represents security and capability. The proof that humans can create warmth in the midst of cold, can generate light in darkness, can maintain a piece of summer's heat through winter's depths. The presence of fire in shelter creates a sense of safety that goes beyond the actual warmth it provides, making the shelter feel like home rather than just a cave, creating the psychological comfort that allows people to rest and relax, rather than maintaining the vigilance that would come from feeling constantly at risk. Fire smoke during daytime has different characteristics than nighttime smoke. The more active burning and the different woods used creating smoke patterns that require different ventilation management. Daytime smoke is often denser and more irritating because softwoods produce more smoke than hardwoods for equivalent heat output. This requires more active ventilation, keeping entrance barriers adjusted to allow smoke escape while maintaining reasonable warmth in the cave interior. The balance is more difficult during daytime because more activity near the fire creates more disturbance of smoke patterns, people moving past fire and creating air currents that send smoke in unexpected directions. Fire maintenance during daytime is everyone's responsibility rather than the specific duty of night watch persons. Anyone who is in shelter and notices fire burning too low adds wood. Anyone who sees smoke becoming problematic adjusts ventilation or repositions wood in the fire to change burning patterns. This distributed responsibility means fire is continuously monitored and adjusted through waking hours, preventing the problems that would develop if fire management were neglected during the busy activity periods of the day. The daytime fire's location near the cave entrance serves purposes beyond warmth. It makes smoke escape easier because smoke naturally flows toward the opening. It allows natural light from outside to supplement firelight during daylight hours, and it creates a barrier that predators are reluctant to cross if they approach the cave entrance during daytime. The fire is not positioned at the entrance itself where weather could interfere with burning, but close enough that these benefits are realized while the fire remains protected from wind and precipitation. Strategic use of fire through the day means understanding when external warmth is needed and when body heat from movement is adequate, knowing how to build fire up quickly when needs change and how to let it drop when warmth isn't immediately necessary, managing fire as an active tool rather than just maintaining it at constant levels regardless of actual needs. This active fire management conserves wood that must be gathered through effort, ensures fire is providing maximum benefit for the resources invested, and prevents the discomfort that comes from fire being either too weak when warmth is needed or too intense when additional heat is unwelcome. You move through the winter day with fire as your constant companion, adjusting your distance from it based on how warm you are from movement and how cold the cave interior has become, building it up when cold is penetrating and letting it drop when warmth is adequate, using its heat strategically to supplement the warmth your body generates and the warmth your clothing conserves. Understanding that winter survival requires not just having fire, but using it wisely through the cycle of day and night, through the variations of activity and rest, through the constantly changing balance between internal heat generation and external cold that defines every winter day. Fire provides external warmth and movement generates internal heat, but the body's position, whether sitting, standing, or lying down, whether curled or extended, dramatically affects heat retention and determines how much metabolic effort is needed to maintain comfortable temperature through periods of rest. Sitting positions during winter rest periods are chosen specifically for warmth conservation rather than for comfort in any modern sense. The most effective sitting position is a compact curl, knees drawn up toward chest, arms wrapped around legs, body folded in on itself to minimize surface area exposed to cold air. This position reduces the body's surface area by perhaps 30 to 40% compared to sitting with legs extended and arms spread. And since heat loss is proportional to surface area, this compact position dramatically reduces the rate at which warmth escapes. The curled sitting position also creates opportunities for clothing to work more effectively. When knees are drawn up and arms are wrapped around them, the outer layer of clothing can be pulled over this compact form, creating an envelope that traps warm air around the folded body. The space between clothing and the folded body becomes a warming chamber where body heat accumulates rather than dissipating into the larger cave environment. People sitting this way often pull hide or fur over their shoulders and head as well, creating almost complete enclosure that leaves only the face exposed, maximum warmth for minimum metabolic effort. Sitting close to fire in this compact position creates the warmest possible rest state short of actual sleeping. Fire warmth radiates against the side of the body facing flames, while clothing and the compact position conserve heat on the side away from fire, body heat supplemented by external warmth without being overwhelmed by it, the combination creating comfortable warmth that allows genuine rest during daylight hours when full sleeping is not appropriate, but when the body needs respite from constant activity. Standing positions for winter warmth are less efficient than sitting because standing exposes more surface area and because the body must expend energy maintaining balance and supporting its own weight. But standing becomes necessary during activities that can't be done while sitting, and understanding how to stand in ways that minimize heat loss makes these necessary standing periods more tolerable. The key is avoiding stillness. People who must stand for extended periods shift weight constantly from foot to foot, flexing leg muscles in patterns that maintain circulation and generate small amounts of heat that supplement static body heat production. Standing near fire is positioned to maximize warmth retention, sideways to flames rather than facing directly toward them, allowing fire heat to warm one entire side of the body, while the other side remains insulated by clothing, then periodically rotating to warm the opposite side. Standing directly facing fire warms the front intensely but leaves the back cold, creating temperature imbalance that's less comfortable than the more even warmth that comes from sideways positioning with periodic rotation. Sleeping positions for winter are almost exclusively side-lying with body curled, knees drawn toward chest, the compact fetal position that minimizes surface area and that allows multiple people to nest together efficiently for communal warmth. Back sleeping is avoided because it exposes maximum surface area, front, back, both sides, all radiating heat into the environment, and because it prevents the close nesting that communal sleeping requires. Stomach sleeping is similarly avoided because it's uncomfortable on the firm sleeping surfaces and because it spreads the body out in ways that increase surface area compared to side-lying positions. The degree of curl in sleeping position affects warmth significantly. Tightly curled position with knees drawn almost to chest provides maximum warmth conservation, but can be uncomfortable for sustained sleep because it creates pressure points and tension in hip and shoulder joints. Loosely curled position with moderate knee bend is more comfortable, but provides less warmth conservation. The compromise position that most people naturally find is moderately tight curl, knees bent approximately 90 degrees, body folded enough to significantly reduce surface area, but not so tightly that discomfort interferes with sleep quality. Head position during sleep affects warmth more than you might expect, because the head and neck area represents large surface area with high blood flow that can lose significant heat if poorly positioned. The optimal head position is tucked somewhat toward the chest rather than extended backward, reducing the exposed surface area of neck and creating more compact overall body position. Hands are tucked close to body, either under the head as a pillow, folded against chest, or drawn inside clothing where body heat keeps them warm. Feet are often drawn up toward the body core as well, minimizing exposure of extremities that lose heat rapidly due to their distance from the core and their relatively poor circulation compared to trunk areas. Children sleep in even more tightly curled positions than adults. Their smaller bodies and higher surface area to volume ratio making maximum curl important for warmth conservation. Children often sleep with knees drawn all the way to chest, essentially in ball shape that minimizes surface area to the absolute minimum possible. This tight curl is comfortable for children in ways it wouldn't be for adults. Their more flexible joints and lighter body weight creating less pressure and discomfort in positions that would be unsustainable for larger bodies. Elders sometimes cannot achieve tightly curled sleeping positions due to joint stiffness or pain that makes extreme flexion uncomfortable or impossible. For them, the group compensates by positioning them in the warmest sleeping locations, toward the center where they're surrounded by other bodies' heat, and by providing extra covering that offsets the increased heat loss that comes from their less compact sleeping positions. An elder sleeping in a moderately extended position in the center of the group with extra hides covering them may actually be warmer than a younger person in a tightly curled position at the group's edge. Position changes during sleep are natural and necessary for preventing pressure sores and maintaining circulation, but these changes need to maintain the compact, heat-conserving positioning even while the person is unconscious. The body learns through experience which positions are warm and which are cold, and this learned knowledge persists into sleep. People unconsciously maintain curled positions even while sleeping deeply, and when they shift position, it's usually from one curled orientation to another rather than from curled to extended positioning that would expose more surface area. The communal sleeping arrangement affects individual positioning because bodies nest together with one person's back against another person's front, creating efficient packing where each person's curled position complements their neighbor's positions. This nesting is not something that needs to be arranged consciously. Bodies find these efficient positions naturally as people settle into sleep, unconsciously adjusting to create maximum contact and minimum air gaps between bodies. The result is sleeping arrangement, where individual curled positions combine to create a group position that's even more thermally efficient than the sum of individual positions would suggest. Sitting positions during waking hours can be modified for warming when cold exposure is becoming uncomfortable. Bringing knees up to chest and wrapping arms around them while sitting creates immediate warming. You can actually feel heat accumulating in the space between your body and your drawn-up legs within seconds of assuming this position. Pulling hide or fur over the shoulders and head creates further warming. These position adjustments provide quick warming without requiring fire proximity or increased activity level, useful when you're cold. But circumstances prevent moving to fire or engaging in warming movement. Standing warmth can be improved by position modifications as well. Drawing shoulders forward and down to reduce the surface area of the back, crossing arms over chest to reduce the surface area of the trunk, even hopping slightly from foot to foot to generate heat through movement while still basically maintaining a standing position. These modifications are less effective than sitting or lying positions for warmth conservation, but they help during times when standing is necessary, but comfort is suffering from cold exposure. Work positions often compromise warmth conservation for functionality. You can't process hides or napstone tools while curled in a tight ball. But understanding which work positions lose less heat allows choosing the better options when choices exist. Working while sitting rather than standing reduces heat loss. Working with body position to minimize exposed surface area, staying curled as much as the work allows, conserves more warmth than spreading out unnecessarily. Periodically pausing work to assume briefly a highly curled position for warming, then returning to work position, allows heat conservation that makes extended work periods more comfortable. The psychological aspect of heat-conserving positions matters too. Adopting curled, compact positions creates a sense of protection and security that helps people relax and rest more effectively. The curled position is intrinsically associated with safety and comfort, perhaps because it's the position humans naturally assume when seeking warmth and protection. Using these positions consciously during rest periods creates both physical warmth and psychological comfort, the combination more effective than physical warmth alone would be. Teaching children about heat-conserving positions happens through demonstration and correction. Parents adjusting children's positions to be more compact, showing them through action how curling up creates warmth, allowing them to experience the difference between spread out and curled positions so they learn directly which positions are warmer. By the time children are old enough to sleep without direct adult supervision, they've internalized these positioning strategies and assume heat-conserving positions automatically, without needing to think consciously about their choices. The relationship between position and warmth also affects social arrangements during winter. People naturally cluster together during rest periods, not just for communal warmth, but because clustered positioning allows individuals to maintain compact positions while still being close enough for social interaction. A group of people sitting around a fire in compact, curled positions, close enough that shoulders nearly touch, creates more warmth for everyone than if the same people sat spread out around the fire in extended positions. The combination of compact individual positions plus proximity, creating optimal warmth conservation. Position during extreme cold becomes even more critical. The difference between adequate and inadequate warmth often determined by whether people maintain maximally compact positions or allow themselves to spread out and expose more surface area. During the coldest nights, sleeping positions become almost ball-like in their compactness. People curled as tightly as joint flexibility allows, every bit of surface area reduction contributing to the heat conservation that makes survival possible through the worst cold of winter. You learn through winter experience to read your body's position and adjust it toward more compact arrangement whenever cold is penetrating, to recognize that the small effort of drawing knees up and folding arms inward creates measurable warmth that offsets the slight inconvenience of the less relaxed position. To understand that position is not just comfort, but technology, a warming strategy as important as clothing or fire. A method that requires no resources beyond your own body's flexibility and your conscious attention to maintaining positions that conserve rather than waste the precious warmth that your body generates and that winter constantly tries to steal. Positions conserve heat that the body generates, but that body heat depends on fuel consumed and metabolized. And winter survival requires eating specifically for warmth production rather than just for nutrition or satiety. Fat becomes the crucial dietary component, not as occasional supplement but as daily staple that provides the caloric density and sustained heat generation that make winter survival possible. The morning meal comes after initial fire tending, and morning movement have begun generating body heat, timed to provide fuel for the day's work, without creating digestive heaviness that would interfere with early activity. This meal is smaller than evening meals, but is still substantial, perhaps 4 to 6 ounces of fatty meat, providing 300 to 400 calories with significant fat content that will sustain heat generation through the morning work period. The fat in the morning meal is not incidental, but primary. The meat consumed is specifically chosen for visible fat content, cuts from animals where fat layers are thick and where fat marbles through the muscle. Lean meat is avoided for morning consumption because protein provides fewer calories per ounce than fat, and because protein metabolism doesn't generate the sustained warmth that fat metabolism produces. The morning meal is fuel designed to burn through the day's first work period, maintaining internal heat that supplements the warmth generated by physical activity. Midday eating is often minimal or skipped entirely during winter because people are usually far from shelter doing work that generates substantial body heat. The combination of activity-generated heat and the fat consumed at the morning meal is usually sufficient to maintain warmth through midday without additional food. When midday eating does happen, it's usually small amounts of rendered fat that can be carried easily and consumed quickly without preparation. A few ounces of fat, providing 100 or 200 calories that extend the morning meal's effect into the afternoon. The evening meal is winter's most substantial eating period, timed to occur roughly 2 hours before sleep, and designed to provide sustained fuel for overnight heat generation when the body is at rest and not generating warmth through activity. This meal is large by any standard, 8 to 10 ounces of fatty meat, plus additional rendered fat or marrow, providing 900 to 1100 calories with extremely high fat percentage, sometimes 60 to 70% of total calories coming from fat rather than protein. The fat consumed in the evening meal is not fully digested and metabolized before sleep begins. Digestion and metabolism continue through the night, slowly releasing energy that the body converts to heat throughout the sleeping period. This sustained calorie release means the body maintains warmer core temperature through the night than it would without the evening meal, reducing the metabolic effort required to maintain safe temperature and allowing deeper, less disturbed sleep. The preparation of meat for winter consumption emphasizes fat retention rather than fat removal. Meat is not cooked until fat renders out and drips away, but rather cooked partially so that fat remains in the meat, providing maximum caloric content with minimum food volume. Some meat is consumed nearly raw after just slight warming, the fat content completely intact, providing every possible calorie that the meat contains rather than losing some to cooking process. Bone marrow represents nearly pure fat source that's extraordinarily valuable for winter heat generation. Marrow from large animals, mammoth, bison, elk, provides perhaps 100 to 120 calories per ounce, almost all from fat. 2 ounces of marrow added to the evening meal provides 200 to 240 calories while adding almost no bulk to the stomach, allowing high caloric intake without uncomfortable fullness that would interfere with sleep. The richness of marrow means it must be consumed in moderate amounts to avoid digestive distress, but within those limits, it's perhaps the most efficient warming food available. Rendered fat stored from previous meals serves as caloric supplement that can be consumed whenever additional warmth is needed. During periods of intense cold or high activity that depletes energy reserves, spoonfuls of rendered fat provide immediate caloric boost. 1 ounce delivering 110 to 120 calories of pure energy that the body can convert to heat. The fat is soft enough at cave temperatures to be consumed directly, though its richness means it's usually consumed in small amounts rather than as primary food source. The fat-heavy winter diet is radically different from diets consumed in warmer seasons when plant foods and lean game provide more varied nutrition. Winter diet is not about nutritional balance in any modern sense, but about caloric density and heat generation, getting maximum calories from minimum food volume, consuming foods that generate sustained warmth rather than quick energy that burns and fades, prioritizing fat content above all other nutritional considerations, because fat is what keeps bodies warm through long, cold nights and through days when activity levels drop and internal heat generation declines. Children consume proportionally smaller amounts, but with the same emphasis on fat content, 4 to 6 ounces of fatty meat per day, perhaps 1 ounce of additional fat from marrow or rendering, providing 500 to 700 calories in total, with fat percentages matching adult diets. Children's higher metabolic rates relative to body size mean they burn calories faster than adults do, and ensuring adequate fat intake for children is crucial for maintaining their warmth through winter, when their smaller bodies lose heat more rapidly than adult bodies. Elders sometimes struggle with the fat-heavy diet, their digestive systems less efficient at processing large amounts of fat, their teeth perhaps damaged enough that chewing fatty meat is difficult. For elders, fat might be rendered more completely so it can be consumed as semi-liquid that requires less chewing, or meat might be pounded to break down fibers before consumption. The group ensures elders receive adequate fat even when consumption is difficult, because elder survival is not sentimentality, but preservation of knowledge and experience that everyone depends on for survival strategies that only decades of experience can teach. The dependence on fat for winter survival creates hunting priorities that differ from other seasons. Animals are valued not just for total meat weight, but for fat content, and the hunt focuses on animals that have substantial fat reserves. Lean animals might be taken if nothing better is available, but fat animals are always preferred when choice exists. A smaller animal with good fat reserves provides more useful food for winter survival than a larger animal that's lean. Fat preservation through winter requires keeping stored fat at temperatures that prevent spoilage without freezing it so hard that it becomes difficult to use. Fat stored too warm will go rancid, developing off flavors and potentially becoming unsafe to consume. Fat stored too cold becomes rock hard and must be thawed before use. The solution is storage in cooler parts of the cave where temperature stays just above freezing, cold enough that fat remains solid and preservation is good, but not so cold that the fat is unusable without lengthy thawing. The caloric requirements for winter survival are substantially higher than for summer survival because the body burns significant calories just maintaining core temperature when environmental temperature is far below body temperature. An adult might need 3,000 or even 3,500 calories per day to maintain weight and warmth through winter, compared to 2,000 to 2,500 in summer when environmental temperatures are closer to comfortable and when body temperature maintenance requires less energy. This increased caloric need means that food acquisition and consumption are even more important in winter than in other seasons. The fat-heavy diet also affects water requirements. Fat metabolism produces water as a byproduct, meaning that high-fat diet reduces the amount of water that must be consumed from external sources. This is advantageous in winter when water sources may be frozen and when melting snow for drinking requires fuel and effort. The body's production of metabolic water from fat metabolism provides perhaps 20 to 30% of daily water needs, reducing the burden of water acquisition during the season when it's most difficult. Fat consumption timing through the day affects warmth maintenance significantly. Consuming fat in the morning provides fuel for daytime activity. Consuming fat in the evening provides fuel for nighttime warmth maintenance when activity-generated heat is not available. The body processes fat slowly enough that a large evening fat intake continues providing energy through much of the night, but a morning fat intake provides energy through the active day and may be depleted by evening, requiring the evening meal to replenish reserves. The relationship between fat intake and warmth is direct enough that people can feel the effect of inadequate fat consumption within a day or two. If fat intake drops significantly, the body becomes noticeably colder, even with the same clothing and the same activity levels. This immediate feedback teaches people quickly about their fat requirements, making it clear through direct experience that winter survival requires consuming amounts of fat that would seem excessive in warmer conditions, but that are barely adequate when cold is constant and severe. The psychology of fat consumption matters too. Fat-heavy foods create sense of satiation and warmth that lean foods don't provide, and this psychological effect supplements the physical warming that fat metabolism creates. Eating fatty food makes you feel warm and satisfied in ways that go beyond just caloric content, creating both physical and mental states that support rest and recovery and continued effort toward survival. You consume fat through the winter day in amounts that would shock modern sensibilities, your body burning through calories at rates that require constant fuel input. The fat you eat literally becoming the warmth that keeps you alive through another day of cold that would kill unprotected bodies in hours. The fat is not excess or indulgence, but necessity, the fuel that makes your internal furnace work, the calories that become the heat that makes survival possible when winter offers no mercy and no second chances for those who don't understand that staying warm requires eating not just for nutrition, but specifically for the heat that fat provides in ways no other food can match. Fat provides internal warmth that metabolism generates, but external cold reaches the body first through wind, and protecting against wind's penetrating effects determines whether clothing and body heat can maintain comfortable warmth or whether wind strips away heat faster than it can be generated. Wind moves cold air constantly against the body, stripping away the thin layer of warmed air that forms naturally at the skin surface and replacing it with fresh cold air that must be warmed again in endless cycle that creates heat loss far exceeding what would occur in still cold air of the same temperature. This wind chill effect can make moderately cold air feel dangerously cold. Air temperature of 20 degrees with strong wind feels equivalent to air temperature of 0 or below with no wind. The difference between uncomfortable and dangerous, between tolerable and potentially lethal. The primary wind protection is outer layer clothing, made from hides that are thick enough and dense enough that wind cannot penetrate easily through the material itself. Bear hide and bison hide work well because their thickness, quarter-inch or more, creates substantial barrier that wind cannot push through readily. Thinner hides like deer or young reindeer allow wind to penetrate through the leather and between fur hairs, undermining the insulation system by creating air circulation in spaces that should hold still, warm air. The outer layer must seal well at every opening where wind might infiltrate, neck openings, sleeve ends, waist, leg openings, because wind that enters through any gap can circulate inside the clothing layers and defeat insulation throughout the system. Neck openings are kept small and can be tightened with drawstrings when wind is strong. Sleeves fit snugly at wrists, tight enough to prevent wind infiltration, but loose enough not to restrict blood flow. The waist is tied firmly so wind cannot push up from below, and leg openings fit closely at ankles to prevent wind from entering and flowing upward inside the leg coverings. Hood construction determines whether head and face are protected from wind or dangerously exposed. A good hood is sized large enough to fit over the head loosely, creating dead airspace around the head and face, but can be drawn tight at the face opening to reduce the exposed area to just eyes and mouth when wind is severe. The hood extends forward far enough to shade the face from wind that would hit directly if the face were unprotected, and it includes ties or toggles that allow the opening to be adjusted, larger when wind is moderate and full face visibility is needed, smaller when wind is strong and maximum protection becomes more important than maximum visibility. Mittens for wind protection are made with outer layers of thick, wind-resistant hide and with inner layers of softer insulating fur. The mittens extend well up the forearm, overlapping with sleeve ends to prevent gaps where wind could reach the wrists. The hand opening of each mitten can be tightened with a drawstring or tie, creating seal that prevents wind from entering the mitten and chilling the hand from inside. In extreme wind, mittens might include covers that fold over the finger area, creating additional wind barrier that further reduces heat loss from the hands. Footwear wind protection is more difficult because boots must allow walking while still providing seal against wind. The solution is boots that extend high up the leg to mid-calf or higher, providing overlap with leg coverings that prevents gaps. The boot tops can be tied or wrapped to create seal, though the seal must not be so tight that circulation is compromised. The boots themselves are made from thick hide with fur lining, the thickness providing wind resistance, while the fur provides insulation against cold that penetrates through wind pressure or through imperfect sealing. Face protection from wind is challenging because breathing requires some face exposure and because vision requires eye access. The compromise is positioning that keeps wind at your back when possible, allowing the hood and hair to shield the face from direct wind. When working in strong wind is unavoidable, people wrap hide or fur across the lower face, covering nose and mouth while leaving eyes exposed. This covering warms inhaled air and prevents wind from chilling the face, though vision through wind-blown snow becomes difficult and breathing through the covering takes conscious attention. Wind barriers in the environment are used strategically, standing or sitting in lee of rocks or trees or cave entrances that block wind, orienting your body to minimize wind exposure, seeking natural shelters where wind speed is reduced. During winter travel, routes are chosen partly based on wind protection available, preferring paths through forests where trees block wind over open areas where wind has unobstructed force. The energy saved by reducing wind exposure often exceeds the extra energy cost of traveling slightly longer routes through protected areas. Wind layering clothing means adding outer layers before wind exposure rather than waiting until cold penetrates. Putting on the wind-resistant outer layer before leaving shelter, even if doing so makes you feel slightly too warm initially, because the alternative is being exposed to wind in inadequate clothing and becoming cold before the outer layer can be added in difficult conditions. Anticipating wind protection needs, rather than reacting to them after exposure has already created problems, is survival strategy learned through experience with the consequences of inadequate preparation. Children require special wind protection because their smaller bodies cool faster when exposed to wind, and because their less developed judgment means they won't always recognize when wind is becoming dangerous. Children's outer layers are checked before they go outside, ensuring that hoods are positioned properly, that mittens are secure, that no gaps exist where wind could reach skin. Children are also kept closer to shelter during high wind periods, their play areas restricted to locations where wind protection is good and where adults can monitor their condition easily. The sound of wind provides information about its intensity and therefore about the level of wind protection needed, Gentle breeze makes soft sound that indicates moderate wind, against which standard clothing provides adequate protection, while howling wind that makes conversation difficult indicates severe wind that requires maximum protection and minimal exposure. Learning to read wind, sound, and respond appropriately with clothing adjustments and activity modifications is skill that develops through experience. Wind direction affects wind protection strategies because wind from different directions finds different gaps in clothing and different weak points in shelter barriers. Wind from the front hits face and chest directly, requiring hood positioning and body orientation that minimizes exposure. Wind from behind is less problematic for face and chest, but can infiltrate up through clothing from below if waist and leg ties aren't secure. Side wind requires orienting body so that a shoulder faces the wind, minimizing the surface area that receives direct wind impact. Moving through wind requires different strategies than standing still in wind. Movement creates additional airflow across the body that adds to wind's cooling effect, meaning that clothing adequate for standing in moderate wind might be inadequate for walking rapidly in the same wind. This is why people moving through wind often wear more clothing than seems necessary for the actual air temperature, the additional layers providing protection against the combined cooling effect of environmental wind plus wind created by the body's movement through air. Wind protection during sleep is why the sleeping area is positioned at the back of the cave, furthest from the entrance where wind might penetrate, and why the sleeping area is surrounded by hide barriers that block any wind that manages to enter the cave. Even slight wind movement across sleeping bodies would create enough heat loss to make deep sleep difficult and to require additional clothing or covering that wouldn't be needed in still air. The investment in wind barriers for the sleeping area pays off in warmer, more comfortable sleep that requires less metabolic effort to maintain through the night. Wind on exposed skin is particularly dangerous because exposed skin has no insulation beyond its own minimal fat layer, and wind against bare skin creates rapid heat loss that can lead to frostbite in minutes during severe cold. This is why every body area is covered when wind is strong, not just hands and feet, but face and neck and any other area that might be exposed if clothing shifts during movement. The consequences of inadequate coverage teach quickly: the pain of wind-chilled skin, the numbness that follows, the damage that severe exposure creates, making people attentive to ensuring complete coverage before exposing themselves to serious wind. Wind protection is not just about comfort, but about energy conservation. The less heat that wind strips away, the less metabolic effort required to maintain body temperature, the more energy available for other activities and for maintaining reserves that provide safety margin against unexpected challenges. A person adequately protected from wind can work longer, travel farther, and maintain warmth with less food intake than a person inadequately protected, the wind protection effectively multiplying the value of all other survival resources. You adjust wind protection constantly through the day, adding layers before exposure, checking seals at all openings, positioning yourself to minimize wind impact, seeking protected locations when wind becomes severe, understanding that wind is not just cold air in motion, but active threat that will strip away warmth faster than your body can generate it if you don't maintain vigilant attention to the barriers that stand between your warm body and the wind that wants nothing more than to steal that warmth and leave you cold and vulnerable and eventually dead. If protection fails even briefly in conditions where wind and cold combine to create danger that neither would pose alone. Wind strips away external warmth, but cold also attacks from below through feet that contact frozen ground and snow with every step. Protecting feet from heat loss is critical not just for comfort, but for maintaining mobility and preventing injuries that could make travel impossible and survival precarious. The foundation of foot protection begins with dried grass packed around feet before any hide covering is added. Grass is gathered in autumn when it's fully dried, stored carefully to maintain dryness, and used throughout winter to create the first insulating layer around feet. The grass is pulled apart into loose bundles, not compressed tightly but kept fluffy to maximize air spaces between stems, and arranged around the foot from toes to ankle, creating cushioning that elevates the foot slightly from the boot's inner surface, while providing insulation that slows heat transfer from warm foot to cold ground. The amount of grass used for foot packing varies with temperature and activity level, perhaps 2 to 3 ounces per foot during moderate cold, increasing to 4 or 5 ounces during severe cold when maximum insulation becomes necessary despite the bulk it creates. The grass compresses somewhat under walking pressure but maintains enough structure that feet aren't resting directly on boot leather, where cold would conduct through readily. The grass also absorbs minor moisture from foot perspiration, keeping the insulating layers closer to dry despite the moisture that feet inevitably produce even in cold conditions. Over the grass goes an inner sock made from soft hide with fur facing inward against the skin. Rabbit hide works well for this inner layer because the fur is soft and dense without excessive length that would compress too much under walking pressure. Deer hide from young animals also works, the leather thin and supple, the fur short enough to maintain loft under compression. This inner sock provides both comfort against the skin, preventing the roughness or chafing that stiffer hide would create, and additional insulation through the fur layer that traps air warmed by foot heat. The inner sock extends from toes to mid-calf or higher, providing coverage that eliminates gaps where cold could reach the lower leg. The sock ties at the top with leather strips, snug enough to stay in place during walking but not so tight that circulation is restricted. Poor circulation to the feet is as dangerous as inadequate insulation because blood flow brings warmth from the body core, and constricted blood flow means less heat delivery to extremities that need warmth to maintain function and prevent cold injury. The outer boot provides structural protection and primary wind and moisture resistance made from thick hide, typically bison or elk, that can withstand the abrasion of walking on frozen ground, rocks, and ice. The boot is constructed with the fur facing inward, creating another insulating layer between foot and outside cold. The boot leather is treated to maintain suppleness even in severe cold. Oils worked into the hide during preparation that prevent the stiffness that would make boots uncomfortable and that would cause leather to crack under the repeated flexing that walking creates. Boot height extends to mid-calf at minimum, providing overlap with leg coverings that prevents gaps. The boot top can be tied or wrapped with leather strips, creating seal against cold air infiltration from above and providing additional support that helps maintain boot position during walking through snow that might otherwise pull boots loose. Some boots extend even higher, nearly to the knee, providing maximum coverage, though at the cost of additional weight and reduced flexibility at the ankle. The boot sole is the most critical area for preventing heat loss. Because the sole is in constant contact with frozen ground and snow that will draw heat away relentlessly if the sole isn't thick enough to provide adequate insulation. Multiple layers of hide are used for soles, 3 to 5 layers of thick leather stacked and stitched together, creating sole that's half an inch thick or more. This thickness provides insulation that dramatically reduces heat transfer from foot to ground, while also providing durability that allows boots to last through the winter despite daily use on harsh surfaces. Some boots include additional insulation in the sole area, layers of grass or fur sandwiched between the leather layers, creating even greater resistance to heat loss through the bottom of the boot. This built-in sole insulation adds to the grass packing and fur layers that surround the foot from other directions, creating comprehensive insulation system where foot is protected from cold coming from any direction, below through the ground, from sides through air, from above through the boot opening. Boot fit is carefully balanced between looseness that allows adequate insulation layers and tightness that provides support and prevents excessive movement of foot within boot during walking. Too loose and the foot slides forward with each step, creating friction and pressure points that lead to blisters. Too tight, and the boot compresses insulation layers, reducing their effectiveness and potentially restricting circulation. The ideal fit allows the foot to move slightly within the boot without sliding excessively, maintains insulation layer thickness under walking pressure, and doesn't create pressure points that would cause pain or injury during extended wear. Moisture management in footwear is crucial because wet insulation loses most of its effectiveness. Feet produce moisture even in cold conditions, and this moisture must be managed to prevent it from saturating insulation and turning boots into cold conductors rather than insulators. The grass packing absorbs minor moisture, wicking it away from the skin layer. The hide layers allow moisture vapor to pass through gradually, though much more slowly than it's produced. The result is that boots become slightly damp during a day's use, but not thoroughly wet if moisture management is working properly. Evening boot care involves removing boots, removing the damp grass packing, and replacing it with dry grass, allowing the boots themselves to dry near fire, but not so close that heat damages the leather, and checking for damage that needs repair before tomorrow's use. Boots that are allowed to become thoroughly wet and then freeze will be stiff and uncomfortable the next day, and will lose much of their insulating value. Maintaining boots in dry or nearly dry condition requires daily attention, but makes the difference between boots that work well all winter and boots that fail within weeks. Extra pairs of boots or boot liners are prepared when resources allow, enabling rotation where one set is being worn while another is drying, ensuring that you're always wearing reasonably dry footwear rather than putting on boots that are still damp from yesterday's use. This rotation isn't always possible. Materials for boots are scarce and preparation time is substantial, but when it can be managed, it dramatically improves foot warmth and comfort through the winter. Walking technique affects foot warmth because the impact of each step compresses insulation temporarily, and the pattern of walking determines how much heat is lost through this repeated compression. Walking with smooth, controlled steps that minimize impact preserves insulation better than pounding steps that compress insulation violently with each footfall. Walking with toes pointed slightly outward rather than straight ahead distributes impact across more of the foot surface, reducing compression at any single point and maintaining more uniform insulation. Children's footwear requires special attention because children's feet grow rapidly and because their higher activity levels during play create more moisture and more insulation compression than adult walking does. Children's boots are sized with extra room for growth, though not so much room that feet slide excessively and create blisters. Children's boots are checked frequently, daily or even multiple times per day, to ensure insulation is maintaining proper thickness and that moisture isn't accumulating to levels that would compromise warmth. Children don't always communicate clearly when their feet are getting cold, making adult monitoring essential for preventing cold injuries. Standing still for extended periods creates different foot warmth challenges than walking does, because standing eliminates the heat-generating muscle activity that walking provides while still maintaining contact with cold ground that draws heat away continuously. During necessary standing periods, keeping watch, performing tasks that can't be done while moving, people shift weight from foot to foot constantly, lifting each foot slightly to break the ground contact temporarily and reduce heat loss. Some people stand on hide or wood placed on the ground, creating insulation layer between boot and ground that reduces heat loss compared to standing directly on frozen earth or snow. Sitting allows feet to be positioned off the ground entirely, eliminating ground contact heat loss and allowing feet to benefit more from fire warmth or from being tucked into sleeping arrangements where body heat from other sources can warm them. During extended sitting periods, boots might be removed and feet positioned close to fire for warming, though care must be taken not to position them so close that leather dries too quickly and becomes damaged. Extreme cold requires additional footwear protection, extra socks, more grass packing, even wrapping of additional hide around the outside of boots to create another insulating layer. These additions make boots bulky and awkward, but provide the protection necessary when temperature drops to 30 or 40 below zero, and standard boot insulation is insufficient. The trade-off of reduced mobility for increased warmth becomes worthwhile when inadequate foot protection would lead to frostbite or to cold-induced pain that makes walking impossible. Foot injuries that limit mobility are taken extremely seriously because inability to walk during winter can be fatal. Unable to gather firewood, unable to hunt or forage, unable to move to better shelter if current shelter becomes compromised. Preventing foot injuries means not only adequate insulation against cold, but also careful walking to avoid ankle turns or impacts that could cause sprains or fractures, selection of routes that minimize hazards, and immediate treatment of any foot problems before they become severe enough to limit walking ability. The relationship between foot warmth and whole body warmth is stronger than you might expect. Cold feet draw blood flow and heat from the core in the body's attempt to warm extremities, making the entire body feel colder than it would if feet were adequately warm. Conversely, warm feet allow blood flow to circulate normally without excessive heating demand, contributing to whole body warmth that's greater than just the local warmth of the feet themselves. This is why foot protection is prioritized alongside core protection, why boots receive as much attention and resource investment as clothing for the trunk and arms. You walk through winter days on feet wrapped in grass and hide and fur, the layers protecting you from ground cold that would otherwise steal warmth with every step. The insulation allowing you to travel and work and function despite frozen ground and snow that stretches from horizon to horizon. Your feet are the foundation of mobility, and protecting them is protecting your ability to survive through winter that offers no mercy to those who cannot walk, cannot gather, cannot move when movement becomes necessary for continued survival. The grass between your toes, the fur against your skin, the thick leather soles beneath your feet, these are not luxury, but necessity, not comfort, but technology that makes the difference between walking through winter and being defeated by cold that starts at the ground and works its way up until nothing warm remains. Feet protected by boots maintain mobility, but hands require even more careful protection because fingers lose heat rapidly through their small size and high surface area. Yet hands must remain functional for the countless tasks that winter survival demands. The inner hand covering is a soft mitten made from rabbit or young deer hide with fur facing inward, creating gentle warmth against skin while maintaining enough flexibility that fingers retain some ability to grasp and manipulate. These inner mittens are not designed for heavy work, but for maintaining basic warmth and comfort during periods when hands are not actively engaged in demanding tasks. The inner mittens fit relatively snugly, conforming to hand shape while still allowing finger movement within the mitten. The design is mitten rather than individual finger coverings, because mittens allow fingers to share warmth, while gloves isolate each finger and increase surface area exposed to cold. In mitten configuration, fingers press together and share the warm air trapped between them, creating microclimate where all fingers benefit from the collective warmth they generate. Gloves would separate fingers and expose far more surface area to cold, losing the warming benefit of shared heat. Over the inner mittens go outer mittens made from thick, durable hide, bison or bear, that provides wind resistance and protection during work. These outer mittens are sized larger than the inner mittens, creating dead air space between the two layers that adds significantly to insulation value. The outer mittens are less flexible than inner mittens, the thick leather restricting movement somewhat, but they provide warmth that makes the reduced dexterity acceptable during periods when warmth matters more than precise finger control. The outer mittens extend well up the forearm, overlapping with sleeve ends to prevent gaps where cold could reach the wrists. The extension is long enough, 6 to 8 inches up the forearm, that even during reaching and grasping movements, the overlap is maintained and no gap opens. The mitten opening at the wrist can be tightened with drawstrings or leather ties, creating seal that prevents cold air from infiltrating inside the mittens where it would undermine the insulation system. For work requiring hand dexterity that mittens prevent, the outer mittens can be removed temporarily while the inner mittens provide basic protection. This allows finger use for tasks like tying knots, manipulating small objects, or doing precision work that thick outer mittens would make impossible. The inner mittens reduce dexterity less than outer mittens do, while still providing enough insulation that brief periods of work can be accomplished without fingers becoming dangerously cold. Some outer mittens include covers that fold over the hand area, creating additional protection that can be deployed during rest periods or during exposure to severe wind. These covers attach at the wrist area and fold over the front of the mitten, creating double thickness across the hand back and fingers where wind exposure is typically greatest. When fine dexterity is needed, the covers fold back and secure near the wrist, keeping them out of the way but readily available when protection needs to be restored. Wet hands lose heat catastrophically fast, making moisture management in mittens crucial for maintaining hand warmth. The inner mittens absorb minor moisture from hand perspiration, but excessive moisture will soak through and begin degrading insulation. During work that creates hand perspiration, mittens are removed periodically to allow moisture to evaporate. Hands dried near fire if possible, then mittens replaced before hands cool significantly. This periodic drying prevents moisture accumulation that would eventually saturate mittens and destroy their insulating properties. Snow and moisture from external sources must be carefully managed as well. Snow getting inside mittens from handling snow or working in it will melt from hand heat and create dampness that ruins insulation. Snow on the outside of mittens should be brushed off regularly before it can melt and penetrate through the leather. During work involving snow handling, outer mittens might be removed and hands protected only by inner mittens that can be dried more easily if they become damp, with outer mittens kept dry for restoration of full protection when the snow work is complete. Hand position affects warmth significantly because hands held at your sides benefit from proximity to body core warmth, while hands held extended away from body lose heat more rapidly due to distance from core heat and increased wind exposure. During periods of hand coldness, tucking hands under armpits brings them into direct contact with one of the warmest areas of the body, providing rapid warming that can restore comfort and function to cold hands within minutes. This tucking position cannot be maintained during activity, but works well during brief rest periods when hands have become uncomfortably cold. Sleeping hand position for warmth usually involves tucking hands between thighs or drawing them inside clothing against the chest, positioning them where body heat will maintain their warmth through the night. Hands left extended during sleep, even if covered by mittens and sleeping hides, will become noticeably colder than hands positioned against warm body areas. Cold hands can wake you from sleep, making hand position during sleep not just a comfort issue, but a factor affecting sleep quality. Work creates specific hand protection challenges because some tasks require direct skin contact for adequate sensitivity and control, forcing temporary removal of all hand protection despite cold. Fire tending sometimes requires direct hand contact with wood to position it precisely. Tool napping requires direct finger contact with stone to feel the fracture points. Hide working benefits from direct touch to assess leather thickness and suppleness. During these tasks, hands are unprotected and vulnerable, making the work periods necessarily brief to prevent cold injury. Between unprotected work periods, hands must be warmed aggressively to prevent cumulative cold exposure from causing damage. Warming methods include holding hands very close to fire, close enough to feel intense heat, or tucking them against the body in warmest available positions, or even wrapping them temporarily in warm hides just removed from near the fire. These warming periods need to be long enough to restore full warmth before the next unprotected work period begins, because starting work with already cold hands means that cold injury can develop rapidly. Children's hands are more vulnerable to cold than adult hands due to their smaller size and higher surface area to volume ratio. Children's mittens are checked frequently to ensure they're staying in place and that snow hasn't gotten inside. Children are taught not to remove mittens during play unless absolutely necessary, and to report immediately if hands are becoming uncomfortably cold, rather than waiting until cold has progressed to numbness that indicates developing cold injury. Finger dexterity decreases as hands become cold, making tasks progressively more difficult as cold increases. This reduction in function serves as warning system. When your fingers are becoming clumsy and unresponsive, cold exposure has progressed far enough that warming is needed soon to prevent injury. Learning to recognize this warning and respond to it promptly by warming hands is skill that develops through experience, sometimes through painful experience of learning what happens when the warning is ignored. Extra mittens are prepared when materials allow, providing backups for mittens that become damaged or wet. Mittens damaged during work need immediate repair or replacement because continuing to use compromised hand protection leads quickly to cold injury. A tear in the outer mitten allows wind to penetrate and undermines insulation across the entire hand. A thin spot in inner mitten creates cold spot, where that finger or hand area loses heat rapidly even when the rest of the mitten is working well. The psychological importance of warm hands matches their functional importance. Cold hands create distraction and discomfort that affects your ability to focus on other tasks, while warm hands create sense of overall well-being that's disproportionate to the small area that hands represent. This psychological effect means that maintaining hand warmth improves not just hand function, but overall capability and mood, making hand protection an investment that returns benefits beyond just preventing cold injury. Materials for mittens are chosen carefully, balancing availability with properties needed for different layers. Rabbit fur provides the softest inner layer, but lacks durability for outer use. Bear hide provides excellent outer layer protection, but is too stiff for comfortable inner layer. Deer hide works reasonably for both layers, but isn't optimal for either. The best mitten system uses different materials for different layers, each material contributing its optimal properties to the complete protection system. The relationship between hand warmth and core warmth is bidirectional. Cold hands draw heat from the core as the body tries to maintain extremity temperature, making the whole body feel colder. But a warm core helps keep hands warm by providing ample heat that circulates to extremities without depleting core warmth. This interrelationship means that overall warmth management, maintaining adequate core temperature through clothing, food, and activity, contributes to hand warmth, even though hands are distant from the core. You work through winter days with hands wrapped in fur and hide, the mittens allowing you to accomplish tasks that survival requires while protecting fingers that would otherwise freeze in minutes during severe cold. You adjust protection constantly, removing outer mittens for dexterity when needed, warming hands near fire between work periods, tucking hands against body when rest allows, checking for moisture or damage that would compromise protection. Your hands are your primary tools for manipulating the world, and protecting them is protecting your ability to work, to create, to accomplish the countless tasks that winter survival demands. The mittens are not just warmth, but capability, not just protection, but the technology that allows your hands to remain functional through months when unprotected fingers would freeze solid in less time than it takes to gather a single armload of firewood. Individual warmth strategies, clothing, position, food, fire, work well enough during moderate cold, but during severe cold, survival depends on multiplying warmth through group proximity that creates collective heat, far exceeding what any individual could generate alone. The principle is simple in concept, though complex in execution. Bodies close together lose less heat than bodies separated, because heat that radiates from one body is absorbed by neighboring bodies rather than being lost to cold air. When 10 bodies press together in close arrangement, the heat that each body generates contributes to warming not just itself, but all the others, creating cumulative warmth that makes the temperature in the immediate group space noticeably higher than the surrounding cave temperature. The warmth multiplication effect is not linear, but exponential in some respects. 2 bodies together are more than twice as warm as one body alone, 3 bodies are more than 3 times as warm, and 10 bodies create warmth that approaches an order of magnitude greater than a single body could maintain. This multiplication happens because each additional body adds not just its own heat, but also reduces the surface area exposed to cold air for all the other bodies in the group. Daytime group proximity happens naturally during rest periods when people gather near fire, sitting close together in positions where shoulders nearly touch, and where the collective body heat supplements the fire's warmth. This clustered sitting creates noticeably warmer air in the immediate group space than would exist if the same people sat spread out around the fire at greater distance from each other. The warmth is enough that people can remove outer layers during group sitting, when those same outer layers would be necessary if sitting at the same distance from fire, but alone rather than in group. Work groups operating away from shelter benefit from warmth multiplication by staying closer together than would be strictly necessary for the work being done. Hunters tracking game stay within sight of each other, not just for safety and communication, but because proximity allows them to benefit from each other's body heat during brief rest periods. Wood gatherers work near each other, taking breaks together in clustered positions where group warmth supplements individual warmth and makes the rest periods more comfortable and restorative. Nighttime group proximity is where warmth multiplication becomes critical for survival. The sleeping arrangement where 8 to 12 bodies press together under shared hides, creating temperature environment dramatically warmer than any individual could maintain sleeping alone. The sleeping group essentially functions as a collective organism, multiple bodies generating heat that accumulates in the shared space under the covers, rather than radiating away into the cold cave air. The temperature increase from group sleeping is measurable. A single person sleeping in the prepared bedding system with good fire management might maintain sleeping area temperature around 45 degrees, requiring significant metabolic effort to sustain core temperature through the night. 8 people sleeping together in the same bedding system creates sleeping area temperature of 60 to 65 degrees, warm enough that bodies can maintain core temperature with minimal metabolic effort, allowing deep restorative sleep rather than the lighter, more disturbed sleep that comes from fighting cold all night. The positioning within the sleeping group determines how much warmth multiplication benefit each person receives. People in the center of the group, typically children and more vulnerable individuals, are surrounded by heat-generating bodies on all sides, experiencing the maximum warmth multiplication effect. People at the outer edges of the group benefit less because one side of their body is exposed to cooler cave air rather than warmed by neighboring bodies. But they still benefit significantly compared to sleeping alone because the warm bodies nearby reduce heat loss even for edge positions. The rotation system that moves people from warmer center positions to cooler edge positions through the night ensures that warmth multiplication benefits are distributed somewhat equitably, with no one bearing the burden of edge positions for the entire night, while others enjoy center positions continuously. This rotation acknowledges that even with warmth multiplication, position matters, and that fairness in distributing positions helps maintain group cohesion that the survival strategy depends on. Children benefit disproportionately from warmth multiplication because their smaller bodies generate less total heat but lose heat faster per unit of body weight due to higher surface area to volume ratios. A child sleeping alone would struggle to maintain adequate warmth even in good bedding with good fire management. But a child sleeping surrounded by adult bodies receives so much external heat from those surrounding bodies that maintaining warmth requires minimal metabolic effort. This warmth multiplication is what makes child survival through winter possible despite their thermal disadvantages. Elders benefit similarly, their reduced heat generation capacity supplemented by warmth from younger, more robust adults around them. An elder sleeping alone might need to maintain very high metabolism just to avoid dangerous cold exposure, but an elder sleeping in good position within the group can rest comfortably with modest metabolic effort because heat from neighbors supplements their own limited heat production. The communal sleeping arrangement also provides warmth multiplication beyond just direct heat transfer between bodies. The shared hide covers trap warm air more effectively when draped over multiple bodies than when covering a single body. The multiple bodies reducing the undercover volume relative to surface area and creating more efficient heat retention. The breathing of multiple people raises humidity in the enclosed space slightly, and higher humidity air feels warmer than dry air at the same temperature. These secondary effects add to the primary warmth multiplication from direct heat sharing. Group proximity affects psychological warmth as well as physical warmth. Feeling surrounded by others creates a sense of security and protection that allows relaxation and rest, while isolation creates vigilance and tension that interferes with sleep even if physical temperature is adequate. This psychological component of group warmth is real, even though it's not directly measurable. People sleeping in groups report feeling warmer and more comfortable than people sleeping alone, even when objective temperature measurements show smaller differences than subjective reports suggest. The trust required for group sleeping, allowing yourself to be vulnerable and unconscious while pressed against others, depending on them for warmth and safety, creates social bonds that extend beyond the sleeping period into daytime interactions and cooperation. Groups that sleep together successfully develop the cohesion and mutual reliance that makes other cooperative survival strategies work more effectively. The warmth multiplication is thus not just physical phenomenon, but social one. The nighttime closeness, supporting daytime cooperation that improves overall survival chances for everyone. Warmth multiplication breaks down if group members don't contribute adequately to the collective heat. A person who is ill and not generating normal body heat, or who has somehow become very cold before joining the sleeping group, essentially takes warmth from the group without contributing equivalent warmth back. This creates slight burden on other group members, who must generate extra heat to warm the cold person while also maintaining their own warmth. The group accepts this burden when the cold person's condition is temporary, understanding that illness or unusual cold exposure could happen to anyone, and that helping each other through these situations is how everyone survives long term. The size of the sleeping group affects warmth multiplication in complex ways. Very small groups of 3 or 4 people don't achieve the multiplication effect that larger groups experience, with each person in a small group still exposed to significant cold surface area relative to the warmth they receive from neighbors. Groups of 8 to 12 people seem to achieve optimal warmth multiplication, where almost everyone benefits significantly from the collective heat. Groups larger than 12 become difficult to arrange efficiently in available space, and may not achieve additional warmth benefits that justify the increased complexity of organizing so many people. Some groups experiment with 2-layer sleeping arrangements during extreme cold, with some people sleeping in a lower layer close to the floor, and others sleeping in an upper layer on top of the first layer, theoretically increasing warmth multiplication by creating more surface area contact between warm bodies. These experiments generally don't work well because the upper layer people compress and restrict the lower layer, creating discomfort that disrupts sleep more than any warmth gain justifies, and because the arrangement makes position changing during the night nearly impossible without disturbing everyone. Warmth multiplication extends to other group activities beyond sleeping. Multiple people working together on hide processing or tool making benefit from collective body heat that makes the workspace warmer than it would be if each person worked separately. The warmth isn't as dramatic as sleeping proximity creates, but it's enough that group work can happen comfortably in temperatures where individual work would be uncomfortably cold. This creates incentive for group work arrangements that have warmth benefits beyond just the efficiency of multiple people accomplishing tasks together. Children learn about warmth multiplication through direct experience, feeling how much warmer it is to sleep pressed against adults versus sleeping slightly separated, noticing how sitting in a cluster is warmer than sitting spread out, observing that groups gathered together seem more comfortable than individuals alone. The lesson is learned viscerally before it's understood conceptually, the body teaching what words don't need to explain. The strategy of warmth multiplication through group proximity is fundamentally different from strategies that increase individual heat generation. It doesn't require more food, doesn't demand more activity, doesn't need additional fire fuel. It's a strategy that costs essentially nothing beyond the social willingness to accept proximity and the trust to maintain cooperation. This makes it extraordinarily valuable in winter when resources are scarce and when conservation of calories and fuel is as important as generating warmth. The group proximity strategy provides warmth for free, creating thermal benefit from nothing more than arrangement of bodies in space, turning social cohesion into literal warmth that keeps everyone alive through nights that would kill isolated individuals despite their best efforts to stay warm alone. You sleep through winter nights pressed against others, their warmth mixing with yours, the collective heat creating temperatures that make rest possible when sleeping alone would mean fighting cold through every hour of darkness. You wake warm enough to function, rested enough to work, preserved through another night by the multiplication effect that turns 10 vulnerable individuals into one collective organism that generates and conserves warmth with efficiency that no individual could match. The proximity is not always comfortable, the closeness sometimes challenging, but the warmth is real, and the survival it enables is absolute, making the discomfort acceptable as price for staying alive through months when cold would kill anyone foolish enough to think they could survive winter alone. The group proximity creates collective warmth through the night, but daytime warmth management requires understanding how winter sun, weak though it is, can be captured and used to supplement body heat and reduce the metabolic effort needed to stay warm through the short daylight hours. Winter sun is not the powerful warming force that summer sun provides. Its angle is too low, its strength too diminished by the long path through atmosphere, its duration too brief in the shortened days. But even weak winter sun provides measurable warmth that makes a difference when every degree of temperature matters for survival, when the margin between adequate warmth and dangerous cold is narrow enough that capturing even minor heat sources becomes worthwhile strategy. The morning sun, when it appears at all through winter clouds, first touches the south-facing cave entrance, where strategic positioning allows the weak rays to penetrate several feet into the interior. People position themselves to intercept this morning light, standing or sitting where the pale sunbeams fall, turning their bodies to expose maximum surface area to the warming rays. The sun's heat is modest, perhaps raising surface temperature of skin and clothing by 5 to 10 degrees. But this modest warming supplements body heat and reduces the metabolic effort needed to maintain comfortable temperature during the morning transition from sleep to activity. The timing of sun exposure is strategic. Capturing morning sun provides warmth during the period when bodies are still sluggish from sleep and haven't yet built up heat through activity. Midday sun, if it breaks through clouds, provides warmth during the period when outside temperature peaks and when work activity generates body heat that makes additional external warmth less critical. Afternoon sun offers final warming before the temperature drops toward evening cold, providing opportunity to build up body heat that will carry into the early evening period before sleep preparation begins. The duration of useful sun exposure is limited by winter's short days, perhaps 7 to 8 hours between sunrise and sunset in the depths of winter, and only a portion of that time features sun strong enough to provide measurable warming. Clouds frequently obscure the sun entirely, making many winter days pass without any direct sun exposure at all. The scarcity of sun makes its appearance valuable, creating windows of opportunity that are used deliberately rather than casually, with activities scheduled to take advantage of sun when it's available. Clothing color affects sun warming in ways that aren't immediately obvious, but that matter over the hours of accumulated exposure. Darker hides, bear, bison, darker colored reindeer, absorb more solar radiation and convert it to heat more efficiently than lighter colored hides do. The difference is modest with weak winter sun, perhaps 2 or 3 degrees of additional warmth, but over hours of exposure, this difference accumulates to noticeable benefit. Some people preferentially wear darker outer layers during times when sun exposure is expected, maximizing the warming effect that sun provides. The south-facing slopes outside the cave entrance receive more direct sun exposure than north-facing areas, and work that can be done outside is preferentially scheduled for these south-facing areas during times when sun is visible. Gathering firewood from south-facing slopes allows working in sun rather than shadow. Processing hides can be done on south-facing rocks that capture and hold sun warmth. Even brief trips outside for necessary tasks are timed to coincide with sun exposure when possible. The psychological effect of sun exposure matches or exceeds its physical warming effect. Seeing sun, feeling its warmth, however modest, creates mood elevation and sense of well-being that's disproportionate to the actual temperature increase it provides. Long periods without sun during extended cloudy stretches create psychological heaviness, a subtle depression that affects motivation and cooperation. When sun breaks through after days of clouds, the mood shift is palpable, even though the actual warmth benefit is modest. This psychological component makes sun exposure valuable beyond just its thermal contribution. Rocks and dark surfaces that receive direct sun exposure absorb and hold heat, becoming sources of radiant warmth that can be used after the sun itself has moved on or disappeared behind clouds. A dark rock that spent an hour in direct sun will remain noticeably warmer than surrounding air for hours afterward, providing sitting or standing surface that reduces heat loss compared to sitting or standing on snow or frozen ground. These sun-warmed rocks become valued resources, claimed for rest periods where their retained warmth supplements body heat. Snow reflection amplifies sun's warming effect in subtle ways. Sunlight that would otherwise be absorbed by ground is reflected up by snow cover, creating warming from below as well as above. This reflected light is diffuse and provides less warming than direct sunlight, but it adds to the total solar energy reaching the body and contributes to the cumulative warming that sun exposure provides. The bright reflected light is also harder on eyes than direct sun alone, requiring squinting or positioning that reduces facial sun exposure, a trade-off between eye comfort and warming effect. Children benefit from sun exposure disproportionately because their higher heat loss rates mean that any supplemental warmth source reduces the metabolic burden their small bodies carry trying to maintain temperature. Children are encouraged to play in sun-exposed areas when sun is available, their constant movement generating body heat while sun supplements that heat and makes the play sustainable for longer periods without the cold exposure that would eventually force retreat to shelter. Elders similarly benefit from sun exposure because their reduced heat generation means external warmth sources become more important for maintaining comfort. Elders often position themselves in sun-exposed locations during periods when sun is available, sitting or standing in positions where sun exposure is maximized, while their reduced activity level means they're not generating significant body heat through movement. The sun becomes supplemental heat source that allows them to maintain comfortable warmth despite reduced internal heat production. The variability of sun exposure creates challenges for planning daily activities. Tasks that would benefit from sun exposure must be scheduled opportunistically rather than reliably, with backup plans for days when clouds prevent sun from appearing at all. This uncertainty means that sun exposure is treated as bonus rather than as reliable resource appreciated when it occurs but not depended upon for essential warming. Ice and frost on clothing and equipment can be melted by sun exposure more efficiently than by fire. The direct solar radiation heating dark surfaces enough to melt frost without requiring fuel expenditure. Boots with frost accumulation from breath moisture can be positioned in sun to dry. Hides with ice buildup can be laid in sun to thaw. Even water containers with frozen contents can be thawed by sun exposure when positioning and timing allow. These minor efficiencies accumulate across the winter, conserving fuel and effort that would otherwise go to accomplishing these tasks by fire. The lengthening of days as winter progresses toward spring is noticed and celebrated, each additional minute of daylight providing slightly more opportunity for sun exposure and for the warming it brings. The progression from 7-hour days in midwinter to 8-hour days as late winter arrives is subtle but meaningful. The additional light and potential warmth contributing to the sense that winter is weakening its grip and that survival until spring is becoming increasingly assured. Sun exposure strategy is taught to children through demonstration and experience, showing them how to position themselves relative to sun, teaching them to notice when sun appears and to take advantage of it, allowing them to feel directly how sun exposure creates warmth that supplements their own body heat. The lessons are simple but effective, creating habits that serve them through their lives as they learn to use every available warmth source, however modest, to reduce the constant metabolic effort that winter survival demands. The relationship between sun exposure and overall warmth management is one of marginal gains. Sun exposure alone provides insufficient warmth to maintain comfortable temperature, but sun exposure combined with proper clothing, adequate food, strategic movement, and group proximity contributes meaningfully to the total warmth system. Winter survival is built on accumulating these marginal gains, using every available strategy to create warmth and conserve it, understanding that no single approach is sufficient, but that the combination of many approaches creates adequate protection against cold that would otherwise overwhelm any individual strategy. You stand in the pale winter sun when it breaks through clouds, feeling the modest warmth on your face and the front of your body, understanding that this warmth costs nothing. No food burned, no firewood consumed, no effort expended, yet it reduces the burden your body carries trying to stay warm through another day of winter that tests every survival strategy you know. The sun is weak and intermittent and unreliable, but it's there, and using it is one more small advantage that adds to all the others, creating the margin that makes the difference between merely surviving winter and actually living through it with enough reserves left that when spring finally arrives, you're strong enough to take advantage of its opportunities rather than being so depleted that you barely survive to see it. Sun provides external warmth when it appears, but moisture is warmth's constant enemy, turning effective insulation into useless weight and transforming clothing from protection into liability within minutes if moisture management fails. The moisture threat comes from multiple sources, each requiring different defensive strategies. Internal moisture from perspiration is produced continuously, even in cold conditions. The body generates sweat during any physical exertion, and even at rest, some moisture is produced and released through skin. This internal moisture moves outward through clothing layers, traveling as vapor that needs to escape before condensing and accumulating as liquid water that would destroy insulation. The layered clothing system manages internal moisture through vapor permeability. Hide and fur allow water vapor to pass through gradually, moving from warmer inner layers toward cooler outer layers, where it eventually escapes into the environment. This vapor transmission works slowly, requiring hours for moisture to travel from skin through multiple clothing layers to outside air, but it works continuously and prevents moisture accumulation that would happen if clothing were impermeable. The rate of vapor transmission varies with temperature and with how much the clothing layers are compressed. Warmer clothing transmits vapor faster than very cold clothing because warmth increases molecular activity, and looser layers allow more vapor movement than compressed layers where the hide's natural pores are squeezed closed. This means that moisture management is better during moderate cold with loosely fitted clothing than during severe cold with tightly compressed layers, creating trade-off between maximum insulation and optimal moisture management. Preventing sweat during physical work is the primary internal moisture defense, adjusting activity intensity to stay slightly cool rather than warm, removing outer layers before exertion begins rather than after sweat has already started, taking breaks that allow body heat to dissipate before sweat production becomes significant. These strategies prevent moisture from being produced in quantities that overwhelm the clothing system's ability to transmit it outward, keeping insulation layers dry and functional rather than allowing them to become damp and useless. When sweat does occur despite preventive measures, immediate response is essential, stopping activity to cool down, removing outer layers to allow moisture to evaporate, positioning near fire if available to accelerate drying, or, in extreme cases, removing damp layers entirely and replacing them with dry alternatives if spare clothing is available. The window for effective response is narrow. Once sweat soaks through from inner to middle layers, moisture has penetrated deeply enough that drying becomes difficult, and the insulation damage becomes significant. External moisture from snow and precipitation poses different challenges. Snow landing on clothing, melting from body heat, and soaking into outer layers creates moisture that works inward toward skin rather than outward toward the environment. This invading moisture bypasses the clothing system's vapor transmission design, introducing water directly into layers that should stay dry, creating dampness that conducts cold directly to the body. The defense against external moisture begins with brushing snow off clothing before body heat can melt it. Continuous attention to removing snow accumulation before it becomes problematic. Developing the habit of brushing shoulders and arms and legs whenever snow has accumulated. Teaching children to help each other brush snow away before it penetrates clothing. This brushing seems simple, but it's crucial for preventing the moisture problems that develop when snow is allowed to sit on clothing until body heat melts it. Outer layer materials are chosen partly for their moisture resistance. Bear and bison hides have natural oils that cause water to bead on the surface rather than soaking in immediately, providing time to brush moisture away before penetration occurs. These natural oils are maintained through hide treatment that preserves or enhances water resistance, and hides that have lost their water resistance through use or poor treatment are retreated with rendered fat that restores the protective quality. Hoods and extended collars provide protection that prevents snow from falling inside clothing through neck openings. Snow that gets inside clothing is nearly impossible to remove without taking clothes off, and melting snow inside layers creates moisture in locations where it's most damaging to insulation. The hood design that allows tightening around the face prevents most snow infiltration while still allowing vision and breathing, protecting the high-risk neck and collar area where snow access would create immediate warming problems. Moisture from breath is another source that requires management. Each exhale releases moisture that can condense on hide barriers, on sleeping furs, on any cold surface where warm, humid breath contacts cooler material. During sleep, breath moisture from multiple people can create substantial condensation that dampens sleeping areas and reduces insulation effectiveness. The ventilation gaps at head level in the sleeping arrangement allow moisture-heavy breath to escape rather than accumulating and condensing in the sleeping space. During daytime, breath moisture is less problematic because the moisture dissipates into the larger cave volume and because air circulation from entrance ventilation carries moisture away before it can accumulate. But during close work in confined spaces, or during conversation with faces close together, breath moisture can condense on face coverings or on the faces themselves, creating dampness that feels cold and uncomfortable even though the actual temperature drop is modest. Drying damp clothing and equipment is an ongoing task that requires constant attention through winter. Boots are dried near fire each evening, replacing damp inner grass with dry grass and allowing the hide to release moisture without being damaged by excessive heat. Mittens that became damp during work are dried before being needed again. Outer layers that picked up moisture from snow are positioned where air circulation and fire warmth will gradually drive out moisture over hours while the garments aren't being worn. The drying process is slow and must be managed carefully. Too much heat causes hide to stiffen and lose suppleness, potentially damaging expensive clothing that took significant resources to create. Too little heat means drying takes so long that the item isn't ready when it's needed again. The balance is achieved through experience, learning the right distance from fire, the right positioning, the right duration that drives out moisture without causing heat damage. Moisture affects different materials differently. Fur loses insulation value less rapidly than hide does when damp, but takes longer to dry fully because the dense fur holds moisture that's hard to drive out. Grass packing loses insulation almost immediately when wet, but dries relatively quickly when removed and exposed to air. This understanding of material-specific moisture characteristics informs decisions about which materials to use where and how to respond when different materials become damp. The accumulated effects of moisture management failures are serious enough to threaten survival. Clothing that's chronically damp loses so much insulation value that maintaining adequate warmth becomes difficult even with good food intake and proper activity levels. Damp sleeping areas create cold that fragments sleep and prevents the rest that's essential for maintaining health and energy through winter. Moisture-related cold injuries to extremities can cause permanent damage that reduces function for the remainder of the person's life. Children's moisture management is supervised because children don't always notice or report when clothing is becoming damp. Their focus on play or other activities overriding the attention to equipment condition that adults maintain automatically. Adults check children's clothing for dampness, ensure boots and mittens are dried properly, and intervene before moisture accumulation becomes serious enough to create warmth problems or cold injury risk. The relationship between moisture and cold creates a vicious cycle. Moisture in clothing causes cold exposure. Cold exposure reduces body heat available for drying moisture. Reduced body heat means moisture persists longer. Persistent moisture causes more cold exposure. Breaking this cycle requires aggressive intervention, extra fire heat to drive out moisture, spare clothing to replace damp items, reduction in activity that produces more moisture. Whatever combination of measures is needed to restore dry insulation before the moisture-cold cycle progresses to dangerous levels. Prevention is far easier than remedy for moisture problems, making the attention to avoiding moisture production and moisture infiltration worthwhile, even when the preventive measures seem fussy or excessive. Stopping to brush snow off clothing every few minutes during snow work seems tedious, but it's far easier than dealing with the moisture problems that develop when snow is allowed to melt and penetrate layers. Removing layers before work to prevent sweat seems unnecessary when you're feeling cold before the work begins, but it's far easier than trying to dry clothing that's already soaked with sweat. You move through winter days with constant attention to moisture, brushing snow away before it melts, adjusting activity to prevent sweat, checking clothing for dampness that needs attention, positioning near fire to dry items that picked up moisture despite precautions. The vigilance seems excessive until you experience what happens when moisture management fails, until you feel how quickly damp clothing loses its warming properties, and how much harder survival becomes when your primary protection against cold has been undermined by moisture that transformed insulation into cold conductor. The attention to moisture management is not optional, but essential, not fussiness, but survival strategy that makes the difference between clothing that works through the entire winter and clothing that fails after a few weeks, leaving you vulnerable to cold that will kill if your defenses have been weakened by the simple presence of water where only air should be. Morning arrives with cold that accumulated through the night, and the transition from sleep to activity requires warming routines that prepare the body for the day's demands while preventing the shock of sudden cold exposure that would deplete energy and create misery that affects everything that follows. The first movements after waking are small and internal, flexing fingers and toes that have been still for hours, working circulation back into extremities before attempting larger movements. These micro movements generate modest heat, but more importantly, they restore blood flow that brings warmth from core to extremities, reducing the stiffness and numbness that hours of relative stillness create. Rushing past this warming period and trying to rise immediately from sleep often results in clumsy movements, increased risk of injury, and the unpleasant sensation of moving before the body is ready. The sleeping area retains some warmth from the collective body heat that accumulated through the night, making it warmer than the broader cave interior. Remaining in this retained warmth for several minutes after waking allows the body to warm slightly before leaving the sleeping area and encountering the colder air beyond. This gradual transition is gentler than abrupt movement from sleep to cold exposure, allowing metabolism to ramp up gradually rather than shocking the system with sudden temperature change. Rising from the sleeping area begins with sitting up while still under covers, allowing upper body to emerge into cooler air, while legs and lower body remain protected by hides and by proximity to other still sleeping bodies. This partial emergence gives the newly awake person time to adjust to waking temperature while maintaining some protection, a transitional state between full sleep and full exposure to cave cold. The movement to the fire area is done briskly rather than slowly. Once the decision is made to leave the sleeping area warmth, moving quickly to the fire minimizes exposure time to the cold air between sleeping area and fire. Walking slowly through this cold zone just extends the uncomfortable cold exposure without providing any benefit, while moving quickly gets you to the fire's warmth in minimal time with minimal heat loss during the transition. Fire has been built up by the final night watch person specifically to provide warmth for these morning awakenings. The flames higher and heat stronger than necessary for sleeping, but essential for comfortable waking. Standing or sitting very close to this morning fire, within 3 or 4 feet, provides intense warming on the side-facing flames, enough heat that cold accumulated during the transition from sleeping area dissipates within minutes. The position near fire is rotated naturally, front to fire first to warm chest and front of body, then turning to warm back, then rotating again to warm sides, ensuring even warming rather than having a warm front and cold back, or vice versa. This rotation happens almost unconsciously, bodies seeking warmth and naturally turning to expose cold areas to fire heat until warming is relatively even across all surfaces. Morning clothing adjustment happens near fire, tightening layers that loosen during sleep, adjusting ties at wrists and ankles, ensuring neck openings are properly secured, putting on outer layers if the day's activities will require them. These adjustments are done while enjoying fire warmth, using the warming period productively rather than just passively standing in fire heat. The combination of warming and purposeful activity helps the mind wake fully while the body continues warming. Morning water consumption happens near fire, drinking hot water if possible, or at least water that's been warmed slightly by proximity to fire rather than drinking ice-cold water that would chill from within. The warm liquid provides internal warming that supplements the external warming from fire proximity, raising core temperature more quickly than external warming alone would accomplish. The quantity doesn't need to be large. 1 cup provides significant warming effect without creating the uncomfortable fullness that larger quantities would cause. Movement begins while still enjoying fire warmth, light stretching that works joints and muscles awakened after hours of sleep, movements that generate modest body heat that starts the transition from dependent on external fire warmth to generating adequate internal warmth through activity. These movements are gentle initially, becoming more vigorous as muscles warm and as the body's heat generation capacity ramps up toward full waking levels. The morning meal is prepared and consumed near fire, the preparation activities providing purposeful movement that generates warmth while the fire provides supplemental heat that makes the work comfortable. Eating near fire allows the food's warmth, both the physical temperature of food warmed by fire and the metabolic heat that digestion will generate, to combine with fire warmth and movement-generated heat, creating cumulative warming that builds toward the level needed for the day's activities. Children wake slower than adults, their transition from sleep to wakefulness more gradual, requiring more time near fire before they're ready to begin activity. Adults accommodate this by allowing children to remain in sleeping area longer if they choose, or by bringing them to fire area and allowing extended warming time while adults are already beginning morning activities. Rushing children through the warming process creates cranky, uncomfortable children whose resistance to activity makes everything harder for everyone. Elders similarly need extended warming time, their reduced heat generation meaning they depend more heavily on external fire warmth to reach comfortable temperature for beginning activity. The group provides this time without complaint, understanding that elder knowledge and experience justify the extra resource investment their slower warming requires. The morning warming routine is adjusted based on outside temperature and on the day's planned activities. Colder mornings require more time near fire, while moderate mornings allow quicker transition to activity. Days with heavy work planned require thorough warming before beginning, while lighter activity days allow beginning with less complete warming since the activity itself will generate sufficient heat once movement begins. The psychological aspects of morning warming match the physical aspects. Fire proximity and gradual warming create mental comfort that supports the transition from sleep to waking, while sudden cold exposure creates mental resistance and reluctance that affects motivation and cooperation through the rest of the day. Beginning the day with adequate warming sets positive tone that influences everything that follows, making the time invested in proper morning warming worthwhile beyond just its immediate physical benefits. Pre-activity warming for specific body areas happens as part of morning routine. Extra attention to warming hands before beginning work requiring manual dexterity. Warming feet thoroughly before putting on boots and beginning walking. Ensuring face and neck are warm before venturing outside into wind. These specific warmings prevent the problems that develop when work begins with inadequately warmed extremities. Cold fingers that can't manipulate tools effectively, cold feet that become painful during walking, cold face that makes being outside miserable from the start. The transition from fire-dependent warmth to self-sufficient warmth happens gradually through the morning, the proportion of warmth coming from fire decreasing as the proportion coming from movement and food increases. By mid-morning, most people are generating enough heat through activity and food metabolism that fire proximity is no longer needed for comfort, though fire remains available for periodic warming when needed. The morning warming routine is taught to children through demonstration and participation. They learn by watching and copying adult behaviors, by experiencing directly how thorough morning warming makes the day more comfortable, by understanding through repetition that the time spent warming at day's start is time well spent that makes everything else easier. The lessons don't require explanation because the body teaches them directly through the comfort that follows proper warming and the discomfort that follows inadequate warming. You begin each winter day with this warming routine, the gradual transition from sleep to activity, mediated by fire warmth and purposeful movement. Your body warming incrementally until it's ready to face the day's demands without being shocked into misery by premature exposure to cold that hasn't been adequately prepared for. The routine seems simple, almost automatic, but it represents sophisticated understanding of how bodies transition from sleep to activity, how external warmth supplements internal heat generation during vulnerable periods, how investing time in proper warming creates returns that justify the investment through improved comfort and function that extends through the entire day. The morning warming is not luxury, but necessity, not optional, but essential. The foundation that makes everything else possible through another day of winter that demands your best effort, and that will exploit any weakness in your preparation or your defenses. The day progresses through cycles of work and rest, through meals and activities, through all the strategies that maintain warmth from dawn to dusk. But as light fades and darkness approaches, attention turns toward the transition from day to night, toward the preparation for sleep that will occupy a third of each winter day and that requires its own warming strategy to ensure the night's rest is restorative rather than just barely survived. Evening work is timed to elevate body temperature in the hours before sleep. Firewood hauling, hide processing, camp maintenance, whatever tasks need accomplishing are scheduled for the final daylight hours when their heat-generating effort provides warmth that will be carried into the early sleeping period. This pre-sleep activity is intense enough to create real heat buildup, heart rates elevated, breathing deepened, slight sweat along the forehead, but stops soon enough before sleep that the body cools to comfortable rather than overheated state by the time people lie down. The evening meal timing is calculated for warmth production through the night, consumed 2 hours before sleep, providing time for initial digestion, while still allowing the thermogenic effect of fat metabolism to be ramping up as sleep begins. The meal is the fattiest of the day, designed specifically to fuel overnight heat generation when activity doesn't provide warmth and when the body must maintain temperature through metabolic effort alone. The fat consumed now will burn slowly through 8 or 9 hours of sleep, providing sustained internal heat that makes the difference between comfortable sleep and sleep disrupted by cold. The final hour before sleep is spent near fire in positions that maximize warming, sitting close to flames, rotating to ensure even warming of all body surfaces, allowing fire heat to penetrate through clothing layers and raise core temperature several degrees above normal resting level. This elevated temperature provides cushion that will gradually decline through the early night, but that ensures people enter sleep already warm rather than cold, and struggling to warm up in bedding that will eventually create adequate warmth. But that works better when initial body temperature is elevated. Hot liquid consumption in this final hour adds internal warming to the external warming from fire proximity. 1 or 2 cups of very hot water, consumed slowly, heating the core and radiating warmth through chest and abdomen. The liquid's heat effect is temporary. It will fade within 30 minutes, but it provides temperature boost at exactly the moment when warmth matters most, right before entering the sleeping area where external warming will no longer be available and where all warmth must come from body heat and from the insulation system's ability to trap and hold that heat. Hot stones prepared during this final hour provide additional warmth in the sleeping area. Stones heated in fire for an hour or more until they're dangerously hot, then wrapped carefully in multiple layers of hide to prevent burns, positioned in the sleeping area where they'll radiate heat for several hours after people lie down. 4 or 5 stones of appropriate size can raise the sleeping area temperature by 5 degrees during the critical first hours when bodies are transitioning from waking heat production to sleeping metabolic levels, making sleep onset more comfortable and reducing the early night waking that would happen if sleeping area temperature dropped too quickly. Bedding is prepared while bodies are still warm from fire proximity. Smoothing hides, checking for gaps where cold could infiltrate, ensuring the layering system is complete and properly arranged, positioning top covers where they'll be easily drawn into place once people lie down. This preparation is done methodically, taking advantage of warmth and energy while they're available, rather than trying to prepare bedding after people are already cold and tired and eager to simply lie down, regardless of weather conditions are optimal. Sleeping clothing is checked and adjusted during this final warming period, ensuring inner layers are dry from the day's activities, adding extra layers if the night promises to be especially cold, removing any layers that became damp during the day, and replacing them with dry alternatives. This clothing attention while near fire is far easier than trying to manage clothing issues after entering the cooler sleeping area, where motivation to make adjustments drops because each adjustment means exposure to cold. Children are prepared for sleep during this warming period, their clothing checked more thoroughly than adults check their own, their positions in the sleeping area confirmed, their readiness for sleep assessed so that any problems can be addressed while fire warmth is available rather than after people are trying to settle for the night. Children who need to void bladders are reminded to do so now, rather than needing to wake during the night. Children who seem inadequately warm are given extra attention near fire before sleep begins. The final movement from fire to sleeping area is timed so that people arrive at bedding while still retaining fire warmth, moving soon enough that body heat hasn't dissipated, but late enough that the food's thermogenic effect is building and that hot liquid's warming has been absorbed. This timing represents balance between remaining near fire as long as possible and not arriving at sleeping area so overheated that the contrast with sleeping area temperature is uncomfortable. The transition into sleeping positions happens quickly once people arrive at the bedding. The longer you remain standing or sitting in the cooler sleeping area, the more heat you lose before getting into the insulated bedding where heat will be conserved. Quick settling minimizes this transition heat loss, allowing people to enter the bedding system while still warm rather than cooling significantly before protection is established. Body positioning in the initial sleeping arrangement is optimized for warmth, curling tightly to minimize surface area, pressing against neighboring bodies to maximize heat sharing, drawing top covers completely over the group to trap warmth before it can escape. These position optimizations happen naturally, bodies seeking warmth without requiring conscious direction, finding efficient arrangements through the accumulated experience of many nights of communal sleeping. The final minutes before sleep are quiet, conversation minimal, movement settling toward stillness as consciousness begins its transition toward sleep. The warmth accumulated through the preparation routine, from late-day activity, from the evening meal, from fire proximity, from hot liquid, from hot stones, from optimal positioning, allows this transition to happen smoothly rather than being disrupted by cold that would require additional adjustment or that would prevent sleep onset entirely. The preparation routine varies slightly based on individual needs and on nightly conditions. Colder nights require more intensive preparation with additional time near fire and extra hot stones, while milder nights allow somewhat abbreviated routine. People who did heavy work late in the day might need less time near fire because they're still warm from activity, while those who spent the late day on less active tasks might need extra warming time to reach optimal sleeping temperature. The teaching of proper pre-sleep warming happens through participation and observation. Children watch and copy adult routines, learning the sequence of activities that prepares bodies for sleep, experiencing directly how thorough preparation leads to comfortable sleep, while inadequate preparation leads to cold discomfort that makes sleep difficult. The lessons are reinforced night after night through winter, building habits that become automatic by the time children are old enough to manage their own preparation without direct supervision. The psychological preparation for sleep parallels the physical warming, the routine activities creating mental transition from day's activities to night's rest, the predictable sequence signaling to the mind that sleep is approaching, the gradual dimming as fire is allowed to drop from bright flames to moderate levels that provide warmth without the stimulating effect of bright light. This psychological preparation supports the physical preparation, creating both mental and physical readiness for the surrender of consciousness that sleep requires. You move through this evening routine as darkness settles over the winter landscape outside, your body warming systematically, your clothing checked and adjusted, your sleeping position claimed and optimized, your final consumption of hot liquid and fatty food providing internal warmth that will sustain through the night. The preparation seems elaborate until you've experienced the consequences of inadequate preparation, until you've tried to sleep starting from cold and inadequately fueled, until you've learned through uncomfortable nights that the effort invested in proper evening preparation returns benefits far exceeding the modest time and attention it requires. The routine is not tradition or ritual, but technology, a systematic preparation that transforms winter sleep from something barely survived into rest that's genuinely restorative, that allows you to wake ready for another day rather than waking depleted and struggling. That makes the difference between merely lasting through winter and actually living through it with sufficient reserves. That when spring arrives, you have strength enough remaining to take full advantage of the opportunities that warmer weather finally provides. Winter stretches through months that seem endless in their depths, but that eventually yield to the lengthening days and strengthening sun that signals winter's weakening grip. The strategies that sustained warmth through the coldest months, the layering, the positioning, the movement, the food, the fire management, the moisture control, the group proximity, the careful attention to every source of heat and every source of cold, these strategies gradually become less critical as temperature moderates and as survival shifts from desperate to merely challenging. But even as winter loosens its hold, the knowledge gained through months of intimate struggle with cold remains, carved into memory through the countless small decisions and adjustments and corrections that kept bodies warm enough to function, warm enough to rest, warm enough to survive, through conditions that killed those who didn't know or didn't follow the strategies that made human life possible in climates designed to eliminate warm-blooded creatures who lacked adequate defenses. The strategies are not modern inventions or recent discoveries, but ancient knowledge refined through generations of experience that began when humans first pushed into climates where winter was not mild inconvenience, but active threat, where cold wasn't just discomfort, but killer that needed to be understood and defended against, or else abandoned in retreat toward warmer regions where survival was easier, but where opportunity was limited by competition from others who had the same idea. The choice to stay in winter regions rather than retreating from them was choice to develop the knowledge and skills that made winter survivable, to learn which animals provided the best furs and how to prepare those furs optimally, to understand layering principles that wouldn't be formally explained for millennia, but that worked regardless of whether the physics was understood, to discover that fat provided sustained warmth in ways other foods didn't, to figure out positioning strategies that conserved heat, to develop the social cooperation that made group survival possible through communal warming, to master fire management that provided external heat without consuming resources faster than they could be gathered. Each strategy alone was insufficient. Clothing without food provided inadequate fuel for the body's furnace. Food without proper clothing lost its warming effect to cold that stripped heat faster than metabolism could generate it. Fire without moisture management led to damp clothing that conducted cold despite adequate flames. Moisture management without group proximity left individuals vulnerable to cold that overwhelmed their defenses despite dry insulation. The survival system required all components working together, each supporting the others, creating cumulative protection that exceeded what any single strategy could provide. The knowledge was hard-won through winters where experiments failed and people suffered or died, through gradual recognition of what worked and what didn't, through accumulated observations shared across generations, through the lived experience that taught more effectively than any instruction could. Children who grew up in winter climates learned through participation and observation and direct physical experience what warmth required, what cold did to inadequately protected bodies, what strategies worked and what strategies failed. They internalized knowledge that became instinct, developing responses to cold that were automatic rather than consciously considered. And now you understand, having followed through a winter, the strategies that people developed thousands of years ago and that remain valid today, despite all the changes in human life since then. The fundamentals haven't changed. Bodies still lose heat to cold environments. Insulation still works through trapped air. Fat still provides sustained metabolic heat. Moisture still destroys insulation. Group proximity still multiplies warmth. Fire still supplements body heat. The specific materials might be different in modern contexts, but the principles remain identical, the physics unchanging across millennia. You've learned through this journey how people stayed warm without modern heating, how they protected themselves from cold that would kill within hours without adequate defenses, how they not only survived winter but lived through it with enough success that populations grew and thrived even in regions where winter was not mild but brutal, where cold was not occasional challenge but constant presence for months at a time. The strategies were not comfortable by modern standards. The clothing was heavy and restrictive. The food was monotonous and excessively fatty. The sleeping arrangements allowed no privacy. The constant attention to moisture and positioning and adjustment was tedious. But the strategies worked, and working was sufficient when the alternative was death from exposure. The knowledge has been passed forward through all the generations, from those first winter survivors to the present, sometimes consciously taught and sometimes absorbed through cultural practices that retain the essential elements even when understanding of the underlying principles was lost. Modern cold weather survival training echoes the ancient strategies, layering rather than single thick garments, moisture management as critical priority, high-fat diets for extreme cold exposure, group proximity for emergency warmth, the recognition that staying warm requires active management rather than passive endurance. The story of winter survival is ultimately a story about human adaptability, about our species' remarkable capacity to observe, learn, adjust, and persist in environments that should have been impossible for tropical adapted primates to inhabit. We had no fur, no hibernation capability, no physiological adaptations for cold, beyond the general mammalian temperature regulation that worked adequately in warm climates, but that was utterly insufficient for winter in northern latitudes. What we had instead was intelligence, the capacity to observe that some materials trapped warmth better than others, to experiment with different arrangements and recognize which worked better, to remember what succeeded and teach it to others, to build systems of knowledge that accumulated across generations until the collective understanding became sufficient to support survival in climates where no individual discovery would have been adequate. The winter survival strategies represent technology in its most fundamental sense, tools and techniques that extend human capability beyond what biology alone provides, that transform impossible into difficult and difficult into manageable, that allow persistence in environments that would otherwise exclude us. The technology is simple compared to modern complexity. No electronics, no synthetic materials, no external power sources, but it's no less sophisticated for its simplicity. The elegant efficiency of layered clothing creating dead airspace, the strategic use of animal furs chosen for their specific properties, the communal sleeping arrangement that multiplies individual warmth exponentially. These represent engineering solutions as clever as anything modern technology has produced. Solutions arrived at through empirical testing rather than theoretical design, but solutions that work precisely because they align with physical principles that govern heat transfer and energy conservation. The social dimension of winter survival is as important as the technical dimension. The cooperation required for group sleeping, the sharing of fire and food, the collective effort of gathering resources and maintaining shelter, the care provided for vulnerable members who couldn't survive alone, but who contributed knowledge and experience that benefited everyone. Winter survival was never purely individual achievement, but always collective enterprise. Each person's contribution, supporting others' survival, the group succeeding or failing as a unit rather than as a collection of competing individuals. This social cooperation, in turn, shaped human evolution, selecting for traits that supported group cohesion and collective action. Communication skills, empathy, willingness to share and cooperate, ability to control impulses that would undermine group function. The people who survived winter and passed their genes forward were not necessarily the strongest or most aggressive individuals, but those who could function effectively within cooperative groups, who could balance individual needs against collective requirements, who could maintain the social bonds that made group survival possible. The psychological resilience required for winter survival is easily overlooked when focusing on physical strategies. The mental fortitude to endure months of cold and darkness, the discipline to maintain vigilance about moisture and positioning and adjustment despite monotony and fatigue, the emotional stability to maintain cooperation when stress and proximity create friction, the hope that allows persisting through conditions that seem endless until finally breaking toward spring. This psychological dimension was as essential as any physical strategy, because giving up mentally led quickly to giving up physically, to letting defenses lapse, to accepting cold rather than fighting it, to death that came from despair as much as from temperature. The seasonal cycle created rhythm that structured existence. The preparation during autumn when resources were abundant, gathering and preserving everything needed for the months ahead. The retreat during winter into sheltered existence where survival became the primary occupation. The emergence in spring when the world opened again and movement and opportunity returned. The exploitation during summer when resources were harvested and stored against the next winter's needs. This cycle repeated yearly, each repetition teaching lessons that improved the next cycle's success, knowledge accumulating until winter survival shifted from precarious to reliable for groups that maintained their skills and discipline. You followed this journey through the strategies and skills that made winter survival possible, understanding now what perhaps wasn't clear at the start, that staying warm without modern heating required not single solution, but system of solutions. Not passive endurance, but active management. Not individual effort, but collective cooperation. Not simple techniques, but sophisticated knowledge applied continuously through all the cold months. The people who developed and maintained these strategies were not primitive or simple, but were instead remarkably sophisticated in their understanding of materials and physics and human physiology. Sophisticated in ways that didn't require formal education or scientific terminology. But that worked nevertheless, because the knowledge was built on careful observation of what actually succeeded in keeping people alive. And now, as this winter's story concludes, and as the hypothetical cold releases its grip, you carry forward the understanding of how humans survived and sometimes thrived in conditions that should have been impossible, how adaptation and innovation and cooperation transformed winter from absolute barrier to manageable challenge, how knowledge accumulated and transmitted across generations became the inheritance that allowed populations to persist and grow even in climates where winter tested every defense and exploited every weakness. The strategies are ancient, but the principles remain valid. The specific materials may change, but the underlying physics is eternal. The social cooperation might take different forms, but its necessity is unchanging. You have learned how people stayed warm without modern heating, through layered clothing that created insulation, through strategic use of fire that supplemented body heat, through positioning that conserved warmth, through food consumption that fueled internal heat generation, through wind protection that prevented heat loss, through moisture management that maintained insulation integrity, through extremity protection that prevented cold injury, through group proximity that multiplied individual warmth, through sun exposure that captured available heat, through pre-sleep preparation that enabled restorative rest, through the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who learned through experience what worked and what failed, who paid the price of experimentation with discomfort and sometimes with lives, who gradually assembled the knowledge that made survival possible and then reliable, and finally almost routine for those who maintained the discipline and attention that winter demanded. The cold was real, the danger was genuine, the challenge was substantial, but humans met that challenge with intelligence and cooperation and persistent effort, developing solutions that worked well enough to support survival, solutions that remain instructive even in an age when most people never face the kind of cold that our ancestors endured regularly, solutions that remind us that human success has never been about physical superiority but about mental flexibility, social cooperation, and the willingness to learn from experience and adapt to circumstances that might seem impossible until we discover that they're merely difficult, merely demanding, merely requiring the commitment to understand and respond appropriately to challenges that will kill us if we respond inadequately, but that we can survive and even master if we bring sufficient knowledge and discipline and cooperation to the task. The winter ends, as all winters eventually do, and the warmth that was fought for through months of cold effort becomes freely available as the season turns and the sun returns and the world warms again toward comfortable temperatures that require no special effort to survive. But the knowledge remains, carved into memory and culture, passed forward through the generations, a testament to human adaptability and ingenuity and perseverance through conditions that should have been beyond our species' capability, but that we mastered nevertheless, proving that with sufficient understanding and cooperation, humans can survive and thrive in environments far beyond what our tropical origins should have allowed, making homes in climates that should have excluded us, persisting where we had no biological right to persist, succeeding through knowledge and skill and social cooperation when strength and instinct would have been insufficient. And so the story concludes, not with triumph or drama, but with simple continuation, people waking to another day, having survived another night, carrying forward through another season, sustained by strategies learned and practiced and transmitted across generations, warm enough to function and rest and persist through winter's cold until spring arrives and survival shifts from desperate to easy, until warmth returns without effort, and the strategies that sustained life through the cold months can rest until they're needed again when winter comes around once more in the endless cycle of seasons that humans have learned to survive, not because we're naturally suited to cold, but because we learned how to stay warm despite lacking the physical adaptations that cold climates should require, because we figured out through experience and observation and intelligence what worked well enough to keep us alive, because we cooperated and shared knowledge and maintained discipline through months of challenge, because we adapted and persisted and refused to accept that winter's cold was barrier we couldn't overcome. The warmth was won through effort and knowledge and cooperation, and the winning made the difference between survival and extinction, in climates where winter was not background but foreground, not inconvenience but defining challenge, not occasional test, but constant presence that demanded our best defenses or else claimed our lives without hesitation or mercy. The people who stayed warm lived to see spring. The people who stayed warm had children who inherited the knowledge. The people who stayed warm became ancestors to all of us who carry forward their legacy of adaptation and perseverance, their proof that humans can master environments far beyond what biology alone would allow, their testament to the power of knowledge and cooperation and discipline applied consistently through challenges that seem overwhelming, until we discover that with sufficient understanding and effort, we can meet them and survive them and eventually even thrive despite them. The fire burns low as the story ends, the warmth it provided now just memory, but the knowledge of how to create and maintain that fire persists, ready to be used again when cold returns and warmth must be fought for once more. When winter tests us again and we must prove again that we remember how to stay warm, how to survive, how to persist through the cold by applying the strategies our ancestors developed and we inherited, the knowledge that makes the difference between perishing in winter's cold and surviving through to spring's warmth, the understanding that staying warm without modern heating requires not miracles but methods, not luck but knowledge, not magic, but the patient application of techniques that work, because they align with how heat behaves and how bodies function and how groups cooperate to accomplish what no individual could manage alone. You close your eyes now, having learned what winter survival required, carrying forward the understanding of how it was done, how it's still done when circumstances demand, how it will always be done as long as humans face cold that threatens life and must respond with the knowledge and cooperation that make warmth possible even when the world seems determined to steal every degree of heat that bodies struggle to maintain. The sleep that comes now is warm sleep, protected sleep, the kind of rest that our ancestors fought for and that we inherit through their efforts, their discoveries, their willingness to observe and learn and adapt until they found ways to stay warm that worked well enough to survive, well enough to persist, well enough to thrive and pass forward to us the gift of their knowledge, the inheritance of their solutions, the legacy of their refusal to accept that winter was unsurvivable, when with sufficient effort and understanding it could be not just survived, but mastered, not just endured, but overcome, not just tolerated, but transformed from threat into challenge, met and challenge conquered, through the simple but profound application of human intelligence to the ancient problem of how to stay warm when the world is cold and survival depends entirely on whether you know the strategies that make warmth possible or whether you don't, whether you remember what works or whether that knowledge has been lost, whether you maintain the discipline and cooperation that warmth requires, or whether you allow defenses to lapse and cold to win the battle that our ancestors fought and won through countless winters, leaving us the inheritance of their victory, the gift of their knowledge, the responsibility to remember and to pass forward the understanding of how humans stay warm when warmth is not given but must be created and protected and maintained through constant vigilant effort that makes the difference between life and death, between surviving winter and being defeated by it, between carrying forward to spring and falling short just before warmth returns, between persisting and perishing, between remembering how to stay warm and forgetting the strategies that our ancestors died learning and that we must never lose, because the cold is patient and the cold is waiting and the cold will test us again, and when it does, we must be ready with the knowledge that makes survival possible, the strategies that work, the understanding of how to stay warm that has sustained humans through winters beyond counting, and that will sustain us through winters yet to come, if we remember, if we practice, if we maintain the knowledge that makes warmth possible even when the world is frozen and hostile and determined to take from us the heat that keeps us alive. And with that understanding warming your mind as surely as fire and food and clothing warmed your ancestors' bodies, you drift into sleep, protected and warm, carrying forward through another night the gift of rest that our ancestors fought so hard to achieve, the inheritance of warmth maintained through knowledge and effort, the simple but profound victory of staying warm through winter's cold, surviving through another season, persisting toward another spring, continuing the ancient human story of adaptation and survival and triumph over conditions that should have defeated us but that we mastered instead through intelligence and cooperation and the refusal to surrender to cold, that we learned how to conquer, one layer at a time, one strategy at a time, one winter at a time, until survival became not miracle, but method, not accident, but achievement, not luck, but knowledge applied deliberately and successfully to the eternal challenge of how to stay warm when the world is cold.